A group of men in a chilly, bleak jail yard aim for their latest victim, a silent, unassuming black prisoner whose lonely manner and unwavering look identify him as prey. They see him as simply another victim, a man who has lost his dignity and independence and is too damaged by the system to resist. However, looks can be deceiving. The man they intend to break is not your typical prisoner. He led clandestine operations into enemy territory that others dared to try, and he was once the military's most feared Delta Force leader. The weight of innumerable deaths, each one a deliberate choice taken out of duty, rests on his hands. He is now a pawn in a bigger game after being falsely accused of a crime, and the gang has been hired to make sure he doesn't live long enough to discover the truth. Their initial error was presuming he was a simple target. The second was making him answer. The delicate equilibrium of the jail starts to change as the gang intensifies its threats, laying the groundwork for a conflict that will have far-reaching effects. This is not merely a struggle for survival, it is a reckoning that will reveal the corruption that permeates the system and serve as a reminder to everyone that there are men who, despite everything, are resilient. Please let us know where you are watching from and remember to subscribe before we continue. His time in Delta Force. He inhaled deeply as his thoughts returned to the goal that had shaped his professional life. They had dubbed him the Shadow in the Afghan deserts, a guy who moved stealthily, struck with accuracy, and left no trace. His fellows had put their lives in his hands. Here he was now, framed for a crime he had not committed, betrayed by the nation he had vowed to defend. The thin mattress creaked under Daniel's weight as he perched on the metal cot's edge. He thought of his family when his fingers touched the cold steel of the bed frame. When he came home in uniform with the folded flag from his father's military funeral still in a box, his mother smiled proudly. He had never been able to open his heart. His anchor was those memories. However, he felt the pressure of the present moment. He could see the other prisoners going through the block via the small, reinforced window on the cell door. Alliances were symbolized with tattoos. Intent was communicated through body language. It was easy to distinguish between predator and prey. Daniel was aware of his position. A target. He had already heard whispers. The yard's self-declared overlords, the Steel Vipers, had shown interest. He knew it wasn't good, but he wasn't sure why yet. There was violence simmering beneath the surface, as evidenced by their subtle actions toward him and their looks during meal breaks. Daniel's knuckles turned white as he tightened his hands. With scarcely audible words, he whispered to himself, "I've faced worse." However, the question continued to bother him despite his self-assurance. How much time could he spend here before his adversaries attacked? The surveillance panel of the door slid open, revealing the uninterested face of a guard. "Visitor," said the guard. Daniel got up, his thoughts already changing. Emily had to be the one. Perhaps she knew the answers. Perhaps she was hopeful. Or perhaps the mystery of the betrayal that led him here would only grow as a result of this visit. With his big shoulders slightly bent, Daniel sat in the visitation room and gazed at the glass that separated him and Emily Green. The only one outside attempting to clear his identity, she was his lifeline. But he knew she could see the fissures as her piercing eyes examined him. He was hardly the invincible leader of Delta Force she had hoped for. Not in this place. Not right now. Emily said in a low, urgent voice as she leaned forward. "I've been tugging at every available string, Daniel. There are many flaws in the evidence against you, but it will take time to find them. You must remain safe till then." With his hand resting on the cool steel table, Daniel's jaw tensed. "Secure? Emily, you have no idea what it's like in here. Every breath I take, every corner I turn. I sense it. This is not a battlefield where you can identify the adversary. Right here. They can be found anywhere." With her pen frozen on the notepad in her lap, Emily scowled. "The teeth of steel. They're observing me." With a nearly whispered voice, Daniel confessed. "Assessing me." Before long, they will eventually make their move. His calmness wavered for a second, his eyes faltering. Emily, I've witnessed what they do to guys in here, and I'm not sure whether I'm prepared for it. The often piercing edge of her resolve gave way to sincere concern as her expression softened. You've dealt with worse than these guys, Daniel. You have taken on assignments that no one else would ever consider. I've never encountered a stronger man than you. I had a squad out there. I was in charge. He clenched his hands and his voice faltered a little. I'm alone in here. This is where I've witnessed men break in. Men of strength. Emily's fingers hovered over the glass, saying, I can't let that happen to me. An implicit act of assistance. You won't shatter. You won't, I know that. But you must make me a pledge. You fight if they come for you. Don't allow them to take pleasure in your fear. A glimmer of resolve replaced the terror as Daniel's gaze locked with hers. It's a different type of war here, Emily, but I'm trying. Here, there are no rules and no honor. Emily gave a slow nod. I am aware that it is unfair. I understand that you shouldn't be here, but you must wait. I'll find the truth, it's out there. We're going to show you that you didn't sabotage that pipeline, Daniel. The weight of her words was both consoling and crushing, and he let out a loud breath. There's a reason they set me up. Someone in a position of authority wants me out, and they won't stop. The teeth of steel. They are only the beginning. Emily's eyes were hard as she leaned back. Already, I'm digging. It doesn't add up with the evidence they presented against you. I discovered inconsistencies in the documentation, missing papers, and witness accounts. Her voice trailed off as she hesitated. He's not sanitized. Money that shouldn't be in his accounts is passing through them. Daniel's eyebrows went up. Do you believe that the warden is involved? I haven't decided yet. However, Emily retorted, not just the gang is watching you in this prison. I can blow this up if I can figure out the connection. However, you must give me some time. With a creak, the door behind Daniel opened, and the guard entered. Time's up, stated the guard sternly. Emily's tone grew softer. Listen to me, Daniel. This is not unique to you. I'll be by your side the entire time. Remain resilient. If you must defend yourself, do so, but don't lose yourself in the process. He rose slowly and loomed over the table, ready to go. He looked at her one last time before turning. Just swear to me that you will discover who did this. I want to know why they wanted me gone and why they picked me. Emily nodded firmly at him. Yes, I will. Until I receive answers, I will not give up. Daniel, too. No one in this place is as strong as you. Make sure they remember that. Her comments replayed in Daniel's mind as he made his way back to his cell. Power. Fight. Make it through. However, the truth continued to bite at him despite his best efforts to cling to those beliefs. Piece by piece, he was being worn down here, and the steel vipers were circling, just waiting for him to slip. The cacophony of clattering trays, whispered conversations, and sporadic outbursts of laughter that Daniel missed filled the mess hall. His back was naturally against the wall as he sat by himself at one of the rusty metal tables, his keen eyes sweeping the space. It wasn't paranoid. It was a matter of survival. Scattered across multiple tables, the steel vipers dominated the space like a pack of wolves asserting their territory. They were identified as predators by their tattoos, which combined snarling animals with obscene motifs. Daniel was wise enough to avoid underestimating them. Kane Mercer, their commander, was seated in the middle, his chair leaned back. He looked around the room with a smug smile on his face. Daniel's attention was fixed on the platter before him. Watery beans, bread-like substance, and overcooked pasta. As his instincts cried out for him to be vigilant, he forced each bite down and ate slowly. He had a mental database of every sound and movement. Foster, hello. The room seemed to quiet a little when the piercing voice broke through the clamor. Daniel took a moment to look up. He was wise enough not to give them the gratification. However, he looked up when the voice resurfaced, closer this time. A few feet away, Cain stood with his gang, encircling him like hyenas circling their prey. "What's wrong, boy soldier? Not satisfied with the food?" Loud enough for others to hear, Cain growled. Daniel looked him in the eye, his face composed but uncompromising. "I'm just trying to finish my lunch quietly." Cain laughed, but it was a menacing rather than amusing sound. "Calm. Do you believe that this place is peaceful?" With his gang closing up behind him, he leaned forward and placed his hands on the table. "Foster, you're in the jungle now. Additionally, the weak get eaten alive in the bush." Daniel's hand slightly tightened on the tray's edge, but he didn't flinch. "You'll need to put in more effort if you want me to be afraid of it." The tension was so great that it felt like the room was holding its breath. After a moment of hesitation, Cain's grin reappeared, this time with greater vigor. The wiry man with the crooked nose stepped closer as he straightened and gestured to one of his men. "Boys, do you hear that? Foster believes that he is tough. Let's examine his level of toughness." Reaching out, Crooked Nose grabbed the bread off Daniel's tray and took a dramatic chunk out of it. "Not bad, isn't it?" The group's laughter reverberated like a taunt throughout the hall. Daniel tensed his jaw but remained still. He continued to stare at Cain. Cain lowered his voice to something more acrid as he cocked his head. "I look at you, and you know what I see. A man who has no place here. A man who believes he is superior than everyone else." His tone was brimming with contempt as he spat out the words. "However, Foster, you're not any better. They threw you in here to rot, like any other piece of trash." Daniel was surprised by how strongly the words struck him, arousing the concerns and misgivings he had been repressing. He briefly had the impression that the room was closing in on him, that everyone was watching and waiting for him to snap. Finally, with a firm voice despite the tempest building within of him, Daniel stated, "You've got it wrong. To decay is not why I'm here. And you don't frighten me." Though Cain's eyes had darkened, his smirk had expanded. "Something hazardous. Yes, you will be. Give it some time." Their voices sounded like nails on a blackboard as the group laughed once more. Cain stepped back, but he kept his eyes on Daniel. "While you can, army lad, savor your dinner." Their jeers and laughter lingered in the air as they stepped back. With a leisurely exhalation, Daniel relaxed his hold on the tray. He sensed that the other prisoners were watching him, some with interest and others with sympathy. Some found it funny, but he didn't give a damn. Survival was important to him. With each mouthful a conscious act of defiance, he pushed himself to complete his dinner. Even though he could feel anxiety crawling up his spine, he refused to let them see it. He could feel their laughter reverberating in his ears as he left the mess hall, their eyes following him. Like a poison he couldn't get rid of, Cain's words kept repeating in his head. Give it some time. Time was not on Daniel's side. The Steel Vipers were now making their move, not only testing him. He would also need to use all of his training to survive in this jungle. The residual tension in the mess hall still hung in the air as Daniel walked back to his cell, the fluorescent lights in the prison corridors flickering. His senses were alert to every sound behind him, but he walked purposefully, keeping his head front and his stride steady. A faint echo of footsteps could hardly be heard over the clamor of the prison. He was aware of their approach. The air felt colder and heavier as he arrived to the cell block. There was a quiet expectation in place of the typical clamor of shouting or laughter coming from their cells. With a mixture of fascination and uneasiness, Daniel's gaze scanned the area, cataloging faces looking through bars. He didn't know what they did. The ambush arrived quickly. His only warning was a quick thud of boots on the concrete floor, muffled, before a wiry figure sprang at him from the darkness. Instinctively, Daniel turned and used his forearm to block the attack. His arm was startled by the blow, but his training took over, making every move accurate and effective. Two attackers surged in after the first. A lanky man with tattoos running up his neck staggered back. One swung a pointed toothbrush at Daniel's side, the other went low, trying to attack him. Daniel pivoted, the homemade weapon brushing against his ribs but without making contact. He sent the second man hurtling against the wall after knocking him off balance with a vicious elbow. Daniel shifted his weight and slammed the man backward against the closest cell bars when the third attacker caught him from behind and locked strong arms around his torso. The clang, a piercing metallic scream that caught the attention of numerous observers, reverberated throughout the block. One voice growled, "Come on, soldier boy." Cain appeared, his smirk turned to a ruthless smile. "Now, let's check if your military training has saved you." He was surrounded by the gang. Daniel's fists soared, each blow planned, each motion crafted to save energy. One attacker was knocked prostrate after a good punch to the jaw, while another attacked him with a shiv, cutting dangerously near Daniel's arm. A small line of blood appeared where the sword had nicked him. Daniel did not recoil. There was no fresh pain. "Do you believe that you are untouchable?" Cain stood back and watched his soldiers do the grunt job, taunting. "In here, you are nothing." Daniel didn't respond, just another dog waiting to be put down. Men like these wouldn't care about words. Rather, he seized a chair that had been placed outside one of the cells and violently swung it, causing the inmates to disperse like bowling pins. The block was silent as the impact sound echoed. It appeared to be over for a while. Bravado crumbled, the assailants lay moaning on the ground. Cain, however, took a slow, methodical step forward and cracked his knuckles. "Do you believe that?" Cain scoffed. "Foster, this isn't over." "By no means." The piercing whistle of a guard's baton pierced the atmosphere before Daniel could react. "Split it up." A guard barged in, glaring at the group with his baton lifted. Daniel caught a glimpse of something unsaid in the guard's fleeting glance with Cain. The guard pointed the baton at Daniel and yelled at him. "Return to your cell. Right now." Daniel used the back of his hand to wipe the blood off his arm while breathing heavily but steadily. He didn't dispute. He turned away from Cain and headed toward his cell, but he could sense the gang leader's eyes staring at him with a sneer that hinted at more to come. Cain's voice reverberated behind him as he arrived at his cell's doorway. "Soldier buddy, we're just getting started. Keep one eye open as you sleep." With his palms pressed against the wall and the icy steel door slamming behind him, Daniel entered, feeling his adrenaline start to fade. He looked at his arm's thin cut, then at his own pallid reflection in the little mirror above the sink. Vulnerability was something he had not experienced in years. He wasn't prepared for this kind of combat. He had a mission, his squad, and his weapons out there. All he had in this place were his instincts and the specters of his former self. And until he was dead or broken, men like Cain would not give up. Daniel inhaled deeply, ignoring his trepidation. He could not afford to be overcome by it. Not right now, not here. He could still hear the faint but eerie sound of Cain laughing in the distance. The conflict had only just begun, but the battle was over. Daniel's cell door had a thin gap through which the dull illumination of the corridor lights filtered in, creating weak, warped shadows on the chilly, broken walls. His body was still tight from the earlier struggle as he laid on the thin mattress. His arm ached somewhat, but it wasn't the discomfort that kept him up. The steel teeth were blaring loudly tonight, their insults resonating through the quiet like a terrible lullaby. One snarled from down the hall, "You'd better keep one eye open, soldier boy." The voice was piercing, irritating, and meant to irritate him. Another voice, full with hate, added something. "Foster, no matter how tough you are." Laughter bounced off the walls in waves, echoing, "You bleed just like the rest of us." Even now, with the bars between them, they were unrelenting in testing him. Daniel's muscles tensed as he rolled onto his side and stared at the wall. Their statements were a promise, not just empty words. Under less, he had witnessed men in this room crumble. Each jeer served as a reminder that he was not unbeatable. His thoughts returned to the assault, its swiftness, and its unadulterated brutality. Like a cat playing with its prey, Cain had hung back and allowed his soldiers to take the initial stroke. Not that they had been attempting to murder him. Not quite yet. It was a warning, a test. The actual storm was yet to arrive. Although Daniel breathed steadily and slowly, his chest felt heavy. He was unfamiliar with this battlefield. There were no buddies to cover his six, no defined aims. He had been the underdog in the military, a name mumbled with reverence, even terror. He was simply another target here, though. The silence was broken by another voice. War hero, how does it feel? Being imprisoned with the trash you believed you were superior to? Daniel's mouth clenched. He didn't want to acknowledge how painful the remarks were. He forced his breathing to settle and closed his eyes. But the voices followed, even in the quiet of his thoughts. He was deceived by his own thoughts, which muttered anxieties he attempted to suppress. What if his name couldn't be cleared by Emily? What would happen if he didn't make it out alive? What if the Steel Vipers actually did what they said they would? No. That was not how he could think. He refused. Suddenly Daniel sat up, the mattress groaning under him. Before settling into his lap, his hands swept across his face, rough with stubble. His intellect hung on by a thread, but his heart pounded frantically in his chest. He needed to remain resilient. It was more than just survival to get out of this prison. Justice was at issue. The guys who set him up believed they could bury him here and keep him silent indefinitely. They were unaware that they had placed him in a situation where his training and instincts would ensure his survival. Daniel leaned back against the wall and looked around the tiny, claustrophobic cell. He examined every aspect. The faint graffiti etched into the metal bed frame, the scratches on the floor, and the peeling paint. Now this was his battlefield. A sliver of the night sky was visible through the dirty glass of the narrow window high above the cell, which caught his attention. A sliver of starlight showed through it. A harsh reminder of the outer world, the one he had to go back to. He recalled his mother's face, the trembling hands she used to embrace him before to the trial, and the tears she hid when the guilty verdict was announced. He reflected on Emily, her piercing resolve, her vow to find the truth. They hoped he would live, to endure long enough for justice to catch up with him. The silence was broken by another voice from the cells. Foster. Daniel let out a loud breath and gripped the edge of the bed frame till his knuckles became white. Time was running out. His gut churned with fear, but he kept it to himself. He was unable to pay for it. The men who circled like sharks, teasing him. They desired for him to shatter. Not this evening. Never. With his head resting on the thin pillow, he forced himself to lie back down. The voices persisted, an unrelenting flood of animosity and loathing. But he allowed them to drift into the distance as his attention shifted inward and his mind became as sharp as a blade's edge. The Steel Vipers aimed to frighten him. Before they hit him again, they wanted him broken. Daniel, however, refused to provide them with that fulfillment. He silently vowed as his breathing calmed and his eyes closed. Here, he would live. He would outlive the violence, the threats, and the anxiety. And he will reveal the truth when the moment was right. About the individuals who believed they could destroy him, about the warden, and about the Steel Vipers. One should not undervalue Daniel Foster. And they would soon find out if the whispers in the dark had any other ideas. Daniel's broad shoulders drooped little as he sat in the visitation room the following morning. The harsh glow of the pale fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the chipped plexiglass separating him from Emily Green, and he felt the weight of the strain of the past few nights. Her piercing, focused gaze met his, but it was more difficult to discern his expression. He was reticent, aloof, and afraid, and he refused to confess out loud. Emily leaned closer to the tiny metal speaker set into the table after adjusting her spectacles. "Daniel," she said, her tone firm but full of passion. "I have some positive news." The guarded expression on his face remained same, although his eyebrows raised slightly. "Good news," he repeated, his voice raspy and low, with a hint of fatigue. She gave a nod. "I've figured out how to expedite your appeal. The judge cannot ignore the missing files or the disparities in the evidence. In a week, if all goes according to plan, I should be able to get you out of here." Her words lingered in the air for a brief moment, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Daniel wanted to grasp for it, to allow hope to germinate, but the harsh, unforgiving reality of where he was, a week, smothered the sensation as soon as it appeared. Silently, almost to himself, he said. His hand rubbed the back of his neck as he reclined in his chair. "I'm not sure whether I can stay here for another week, Emily." Her face wavered, the determination in her gaze waning. "One of the strongest persons I've ever met is you, Daniel. Most people can't even comprehend the things you've survived. You're capable of making it." He shook his head and spoke in a somewhat shaky voice. "Emily, this isn't the battlefield. I had a mission, my crew, and my weapons out there." He stopped here and pointed to the surrounding walls. "It's only me in here. And I'm waiting for the next hit every minute of every second." Emily's fingers tightened on the notepad in her lap as her lips formed a thin line. "They won't stop until they break me. The teeth of steel." He gave a sad nod. "Last night, they came at me. It wasn't an all-out attack. It served as a warning. Kane made sure I was aware of the impending event. What's the worst? This is fun for them. The games, the taunting. They are aware that I am a target, and they will soon complete the task." Emily's tone changed from sympathetic to determined as she leaned forward. "Listen, Daniel. You're stronger than them, even though I know it's hell in here. You have persevered through more difficult times. You simply need to wait a bit longer. To get you out, I'm working non-stop." With his hands firmly gripped together, Daniel's eyes fell to the table. "And if they reach me before then, what will happen? What if I didn't finish, thus all of this work you're doing is in vain?" There was a rare flash of tenderness in his voice as it cracked slightly. Emily paused, trying to find the proper words. Even she couldn't conceal the glimmer of uncertainty in her eyes as she firmly stated, "That's not going to happen. I'll find a solution. Perhaps I can persuade the warden to place you in a safer block or advocate for your transfer to solitary for your protection." Daniel shook his head and gave a hollow laugh. "Emily, the warden doesn't give a damn. If anything, I believe he's a contributing factor to my initial presence here. Simply put, being solitary makes it simpler for them to approach me covertly." The impact of his remarks caused her shoulders to droop a little. "Then you must remain alert. Keep your head down. Engage only when absolutely necessary. All you have to do is survive another week." Daniel's eyes were filled with a mixture of desperation and frustration as he met her gaze. "You say that as if it were simple. I hear them each time I close my eyes. I can feel them observing me at every turn. Emily, they're waiting for me to make a mistake. Additionally, He swallowed hard and stopped. "What are you?" She applied light pressure. He said, without raising his voice above a whisper, "I'm tired. I'm not sure how much longer I can stand it." Emily's face softened, and she put her hand on the plexiglass as if she were reaching for him. "I want you to go deep, Daniel. For your mom. For yourself. You are fighting for more than simply your life. Justice is what you're fighting for. For your name. They can't take that away from you." He let out a deep breath as her words sank in. "I'll make an effort. Right now, that's all I can guarantee. I'll make an effort." Their stay came to an end when the guard showed up at the door. Emily got up and gathered her belongings rapidly. "I'll provide updates when I return in a few days. Keep your wits about you, Daniel. This is not unique to you." Daniel nodded slightly and stood up, looming over the table. "I appreciate everything, Emily." The vow she had made weighed heavy in the air as she walked away. A week. 7 days. It seemed to go on forever. A spooky reminder of the danger that hovered over every moment, the faint laughter of the steel vipers reverberated from somewhere down the passage as Daniel made his way back to his cell. He would have to try, but he wasn't sure whether he could make it another week. The only steady sound in the cell was the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Staring at the concrete wall in front of him, Daniel perched on the edge of his thin mattress. He kept thinking about what Emily had said. All you have to do is survive another week. A week was a lifetime here, though. A week meant more taunts, more threats, and perhaps even another attack. He was unable to wait passively. He had to do something. As he thought, Daniel's hands were on his knees, twitching their fingers. Preparation, foreseeing the enemy's next move, and staying one step ahead had always been the focus of his training. He also had his instincts even though he was missing his squad and his equipment. He had survived in urban conflict zones, jungles, and deserts thanks to those instincts. They would also need to work here. He got out of bed and looked around his tiny cell with new eyes. Suddenly, every crevice, every nook, and every fragment of his little belongings became a resource. He looked down at his toothbrush handle. It wasn't much, but it could be something if you put in some work. He started grinding the plastic end on the uneven concrete floor after snapping off the bristles. His restless hands had something to do while his mind determined that it was more than just possessing a weapon thanks to the repetitive action that was grounding. It had to do with communicating. They needed to know that he wouldn't be taken lightly if the steel vipers tried to capture him again. When Daniel had a little spare time in the yard the following day, he moved deliberately. With all the onlookers and simmering tensions, the open area was a dangerous place. The steel vipers remained where they always were, with Kane evidently enjoying the attention his domination brought as he chuckled with his group. A group of older prisoners lingered in the far corner of the yard, where Daniel stayed out of sight. They were men who had learned to live by keeping their heads down and avoiding trouble. They were not members of any gang. He went up to a wiry man named Mac, who had gray streaks in his beard. Mac was well known for his connections and his ability to accomplish goals without attracting undue notice. Daniel murmured softly, "Mac." The older man looked up and nodded greetingly, his keen eyes examining Daniel for a minute before he spoke. "The vipers are focusing on you," Daniel said softly as he nodded. "I need assistance." The sound of Mac's dry, humorless laughter was something to balance the odds. "It is quite difficult to even the odds here. What do you want?" Daniel paused, his thoughts whirling. Mac arched an eyebrow and said, "Anything you have, metal, glass, something sharp." "Are you going to face Kane's crew alone?" "Not intending to do it," Daniel answered. "However, I also have no intention of allowing them to take me out." A glimmer of respect appeared on the elder man's face as his expression changed slightly. "You're brave. I'll grant you that. However, if you don't know the game, guts don't really matter. You expose yourself to heat. You make everyone feel hot. Remember that," Daniel said, nodding. "I have no intention of starting a conflict. Only to stay alive." Mac thought about him for a while before letting out a sigh. "It won't be cheap, but I'll see what I can do." "I can trade a couple of commissary items," Daniel remarked. "Smokes. Perhaps some instant coffee." A slight smirk flickered across Mac's lips. "That will work. By tomorrow, I'll have something for you." Daniel went back to his cell to get ready. The shiv for the toothbrush was coming together. Now the plastic sharpened to a point. To make it simpler to grasp, he wrapped a piece of fabric from his pillowcase around the handle. Even though it wasn't much, it was still better than nothing. He reflected about Emily's assurance and the hope she had given him. A week. At the thought, he could practically hear the steel vipers giggling. A week was more than enough time for them to get rid of him. Daniel's thoughts drifted back to his time in the military and the principles he had learned from years of training. During survival exercises, he recalled what his commanding officer had said. Manage what you can. Adjust to your limitations. He had control over his reaction, but not over the steel vipers. He could make himself more difficult to target, but he couldn't depend on the guards to keep him safe. Daniel sat on the side of his bed with his handgun concealed beneath the mattress as the lights went out for the night, indicating lockdown. The voices began, as he had feared, when he could hear the other prisoners' distant muttering and the occasional shout or laugh reverberating across the block. Foster. Loud and derisive, Kane's voice echoed from down the hallway. I hope you're getting enough sleep, army guy. Then there was laughter. You're going to need your rest. Cruel and harsh, Daniel said nothing. His fists were tight, his mind concentrated, and he sat still. He was unable to be affected by what they said. Not right now. Not with him so on the brink. He would have everything he needed tomorrow. He would be one step closer to making it through the week tomorrow. But tonight, Daniel could only grit his teeth and tell himself, just one more day, as the threats reverberated through the darkness. One more battle. The sun pounded the yard the following day, creating lengthy shadows on the chipped pavement. With his back to the chain-link fence, Daniel stood close to the far corner. The weight of the stairs surrounding him immediately pulled him back to reality, even while the warmth of the sun on his skin served as a subtle reminder that there was life outside these walls. There was movement in the steel vipers. For the last 20 minutes, Daniel had been observing them. In order to keep him in their line of sight, Kane and his crew prowled the yard with purposeful motions. The group dispersed, forming a net that gradually grew tighter as they approached him. It was a deliberate move meant to give him a sense of helplessness. Kane came last, his sneer etched with ruthless assurance, his movements deliberate and slow. Behind him, the group sank in, their sneers full of hate and their tattoos shining with perspiration. As other prisoners focused on what was happening, the yard had become quieter. Everyone was watching Daniel, but nobody dared to step in. Kane paused a few steps away, studying Daniel with his hands in his pockets and his head cocked slightly. He dragged out the name as if it were a joke, Foster. I must give you credit. You have courage to stand here as if nothing were going to happen. Daniel maintained a steady look and a composed yet prepared stance. Kane laughed in a low, threatening voice, I'm not looking for trouble. Well, army lad, trouble is on the way. You see, this place is in harmony. Except for you, everyone knows their position. You've been acting as though you're superior to the rest of us and untouchable. Although Daniel's hands were still by his sides, they twitched a little, as if they might need to move. I don't believe I'm superior to anyone. All I want to do is serve my time and leave. Kane's eyes darkened, but his smirk grew wider. Take your time. That's adorable. The issue is that you won't make it that far. He leaned closer tonight, his voice becoming almost a whisper. You're going to die tonight. Suffocating and thick, the words hung in the air. Despite the tightness in his stomach, Daniel remained silent. His voice steady, he looked directly into Kane's eyes. Are you certain that's what you want to do? Kane chuckled, taking a step back and gesturing to his crew. Yes, we are certain. And what do you know? I will relish every moment of it. Do you believe you will be saved by military training? Foster, this isn't a battle zone. It's just you and us, no backup, no team. A stocky thug with a jagged scar across his cheek, one of Kane's men, stepped forward. Soldier boy, I hope you said your prayers. Your chances of surviving the night are slim. With a chorus of vicious laughter, the others joined in. Daniel remained quiet as he studied their faces, noting their gestures and cues. To get him to slip, they were attempting to shake him. With his voice brimming with hatred, Cain drew closer once again. "No one is coming to save you, no matter how hard you try to fight or run. And I'll make sure you know precisely who did it when it's all done and you're bleeding out on that hard, cold floor." Despite the pressure of their words, Daniel managed to maintain his composure. He couldn't allow them to use fear as a weapon against him. Rather, he spoke in a quiet, controlled voice while cocking his head slightly. "I'll make sure none of you forget it if I'm still standing in the morning, so you better make it matter." After a moment of hesitation, Cain's grin reappeared, sharper than before. "Foster, we'll see about that." Tick-tock. After marking their prey, Cain turned and left, his followers trailing behind him like a pack of wolves. The yard gradually reverted to its typical cadence, but the strain persisted, oppressive and heavy. For a minute, Daniel stood motionless, his thoughts racing. There was more to the menace. He heard it in their voices and saw it in their eyes. They were coming for him tonight, and it would be his last day if he wasn't prepared. His jaw tightened and his hands clenched as he made his way back to his cell. Even though he had experienced death before, this time felt different. There was no higher purpose or objective. Only to survive. He pulled the homemade shiv from beneath the mattress and sat on the edge of his bed as he made his way to his cell. He tested the edge's sharpness by running his thumb along it. It was all he had, but it wasn't ideal. Leaning back against the wall, Daniel took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. He was battling for more than himself. He was struggling to escape, to regain the life that had been taken from him, and to prove his innocence. Daniel Foster would be prepared for the arrival of the Steel Vipers tonight. Steam rose from the tiled floor in thin, spectral wisps as the sound of running water filled the shower area. Under one of the spigots, Daniel stood with the lukewarm water dripping over his shoulders. There was silence in the room. Too silent. There was no background hum of shuffling feet, no idle talk, no chatter. His nerves were jangled by the strained, unsettling silence that took the place of the normal hum of jail life. He turned a little, looking around the room. The white tiles, which had been neglected for years, were chipped and discolored as the shower head rose extended. There was nobody else inside. That was unusual in and of itself. His gut told him to go out, but before he could do so, the sound of heavy feet reverberated from the doorway. Water streaming from his hair, he turned abruptly and beheld the Steel Vipers and Cain. Like ghosts, their outlines sliced through the steam, and there were 6 of them. As if this were just another day in the yard, Cain was at the front with his hands in his pockets and a big, cruel grin. "Foster." Cain drew lead, his voice resonating menacingly in the cramped room. "I assume you missed the memo. The timing for the shower has been moved. Only for you." Without replying, Daniel's gaze strayed to the doorway. The entryway was filled with the large frames of 2 of Cain's men as they proceeded to block the sole exit. Cain cocked his head in a dejected manner. "What's wrong, boy soldier? You haven't started running yet?" With his head racing, Daniel took a hesitant step back, his bare feet clutching the damp tiles. He had no weapons, was outnumbered, and was surrounded. With the exception of the shiv he had concealed behind his jail pants waistline. Cain took a step closer, his grin growing. "Did we not warn you of this coming? Foster, this is the night. Let's see your true level of toughness." A wiry figure with a scar along his cheek, the first man lunged. In an automatic reaction, Daniel sidestepped the assault and rammed his elbow into the man's ribs. The assailant stumbled back with a grunt. However, Daniel was approached from the side by another before he could follow up. Daniel reeled after the hit landed in his jaw. The room seemed to enclose him as he stumbled and struggled to maintain his balance. "Not so hard anymore, isn't it?" A sneer pierced the steam as one of the gang members said. Daniel remained silent. His vision cleared just in time to spot the second assailant as he shrugged off the blow. A burly man with a neck covered in tattoos. Daniel charged at him and dipped low, knocking the man into the wall and ramming his shoulder into his stomach. Daniel didn't have time to celebrate, but the contact blasted a devastating thump through the room. He was yanked backward by another pair of hands that grabbed him from behind. His elbow struck the assailant's face as he twisted. However, the man clung to it. Like a vice. Cain leaned nonchalantly against the wall and observed from a distance. He laughed and remarked, "This is pathetic. Foster, hurry up. Show us your military experience." Or was it all just rhetoric? Taking the shiv from his waistband, Daniel snarled. He cut at the arms that held him, the keen edge gleaming momentarily in the little light. Daniel turned around, his body coiled and ready, his breaths heavy as the man yelled and let go. The group, however, did not waver. They circled him in unison, their movements planned and rehearsed. This ambush was no accident. They had this planned. His left was the next to attack. The plastic edge of Daniel's shiv sliced through the steam as he swung it. However, the assailant sidestepped and punched Daniel in the ribs. He was in excruciating pain, but he persisted. The man sprawled to the ground after he slammed his shoulder into him, but someone else grabbed him again. Their numbers and cooperation were overwhelming him, forcing him into a corner. At last, Cain took a step forward and gritted his teeth. "Guys, let me demonstrate how to accomplish it." Daniel was struck in the side of the head by Cain's forceful blow. Daniel went to his knees as the world briefly whirled. The gang drew in, their laughing resonating around him, and he found it difficult to breathe as the taste of blood filled his lips. Cain grabbed a grip of Daniel Foster's hair and pulled his head back, taunting him, "Looks like the great Daniel Foster isn't so great after all." A final remark, military boy. Daniel's hold on the shiv became more firm. His vision was blurry and his body hurt. He wasn't finished yet, though. Stronger than before, he swung upward, piercing Cain's forearm with the blade. Howling, Cain staggered back, gripping his arm. When they saw their leader hurt, the group momentarily paused, losing momentum. Daniel faced them, his chest heaving as he clambered to his feet using the opening. Even though he had little chance of winning, he wasn't giving up easily. Cain screamed, his voice full with anger, "Finish him." As the battle became chaotic, Daniel prepared himself as the gang charged forward once more. As Daniel strained to keep upright, his ribs screamed in anguish as his back struck the chilly tiles. Like a pack of wolves, the steel vipers rushed at him, their movements vicious and unrelenting. The only thing that kept him from being swamped was the shiv he was holding, its keen edge cutting through the steam-filled air. From the corner, Cain yelled commands while gripping the gushing wound on his forearm, his face contorted in anger. "Keep going. He is nothing. Take him out." With a wall of force and velocity, the largest member of the gang lunged at Daniel. Daniel moved aside, causing the shiv to collide with the man's shoulder. As the assailant stumbled, a yell of pain reverberated across the room. However, Daniel was already on the back of another gang member, who had his arm locked around his throat. Daniel felt his air being cut off by the pressure, and he clenched his teeth, his vision shrinking. The back of his skull struck the assailant's nose as he slammed his head back. Just enough room was created by the pleasurable crunch of cartilage for him to break away, twist around, and punch the man hard in the jaw. But they were too numerous. The shiv skittered over the wet tiles, out of reach, and Daniel sprawled to the ground after taking a hard kick to his side. As he attempted to crawl closer the weapon, his muscles burned and he gasped for air. "You're not that tough anymore." With a smirk, one of the gang members kicked him in the ribs once more. In order to shield himself as much as possible, Daniel curled inward. However, the attacks continued. Desperate to find a way out, he searched his head for any opportunity to take advantage of. However, the gang was unrelenting, with well-planned and vicious attacks. With his boots splattering in the puddles on the ground, Cain took a step forward. He squatted beside Daniel, his smile menacing. "Foster, this is what happens when you don't know where you belong. Here, you're simply another piece of meat. You're going to bleed like one now." Daniel attempted to move, but was forced back down by a large hand. His body screamed in agony as he breathed in ragged gasps. The weight of his predicament was pressing down on him as he felt the icy edge of a shiv push against his neck. Then the noise of a baton hitting metal broke the confusion like a thunderclap. A voice yelled, clear and strong, "Back off." The group froze and snapped their heads in the direction of the entryway. Adrian Jones, the guard who had worked under Daniel in his Delta Force days, was standing there with a baton in his hand and rage in his eyes. Jones entered the room with authority and yelled, "What the hell's going on in here?" The dynamic seemed to change just by his appearance. As they considered their next course of action, the gang hesitated. Cain's grin wavered, but he quickly covered it up with a confident grin. "You're not worried about this, Jones. Get out of here." Jones' baton made a loud cracking sound as it hit the tiles, echoing around the room. "Back off," I shouted, "or do you want me to summon all the guards on this block and bring you all in handcuffs out of here?" The group looked at each other uneasily, their confidence faltering. As Cain gazed down at Jones, his hands clenched into fists and his jaw grew taut. "You believe you can keep him safe? It's not over yet." With his baton ready, Jones stepped forward once more. "It's not, you're right, but I'll make sure it's over for everyone if you don't go now." Cain paused forever, his instinct of self-preservation fighting his pride. A tense minute later, he gestured to his staff. "Come on." The group withdrew, their footsteps reverberating as they vanished into the hallway. Cain continued to stare at Daniel for a second longer. "Foster, this isn't over." "By no means." Jones hurried to Daniel's side after waiting until the last of them were gone. He crouching to assist him in sitting up, he whispered, "Jesus, Daniel. You were severely damaged by them." Daniel attempted a small smile despite coughing up blood. "I've experienced worse." Anger tightened Jones's face as he shook his head. "You have no business being here. This isn't the place for you." Daniel looked into Jones's eyes. His eyes showed how serious his predicament was. "Tell me something I'm not familiar with." With a strong grasp, Jones helped him stand up. "Let's get you cleaned up, please. Keep that shiv near, Daniel. They will return." As they walked out of the shower area, Daniel nodded, his body hurting with each step. It was by no means the end of the conflict. For now, however, he remained upright. And he wasn't going down without a fight as long as he was still alive. With each short breath, Daniel's ribs hurt as he sat on the side of his bed. His swollen knuckles were still slightly tinged with blood from the battle, and his head was leaning against the chilly concrete wall. Shadows swirled over his bruised face as the faint light overhead flickered and faded. He closed his eyes and relived what had happened in the shower room. He was still aware that he wouldn't make it out of that room alive, that Cain's hand was pressing down on his neck, and that every hit hurt like hell. His eyes snapped awake when he was startled by a sharp knock on the bars of his cell. He tensed automatically, his body coiling as though he were about to be attacked again. However, he looked up to see Adrian Jones standing there, his presence steady but his countenance enigmatic. "Jones," Daniel remarked in a raspy voice. Before approaching the bars, Jones looked up and down the hallway to make sure no one was looking. "Are you all okay?" With a sigh, Daniel's shoulders relaxed a little. "Better?" With his baton tucked under his arm, Jones leaned against the bars. "I suspected they would eventually target you. Cain refuses to appear weak in front of others. And you, both physically and figuratively, cut deep." Daniel gave a slight smirk, but it was transformed into a frown by the ache in his side. "I assumed that was all there was to it." His voice trailed off, the weight of what may have been weighing on him, if you hadn't shown up. Jones's jaw tensed as he nodded. Let's not sugarcoat the fact that you held your own longer than others would have. Daniel, they had you. They took you, and they will return. With his fingertips grazing the bruises that were developing over his cheekbone, Daniel wiped a hand across his face. Yes, I had assumed that. With a gloomy and regretful tone, Jones lowered his voice. I can't do much, you see. The majority of the guards here don't give a damn about what happens to someone like you, and the warden has his own regulations. They will not expose their necks. Not for you. Not for everyone. With the fleeting hope he had experienced fading like a candle in the wind, Daniel's stomach fell. But I'll do all I can, Jones added, bending closer. I will watch Kane and his team. For a while, try to keep them away from you. It's something, but not much. With a hint of appreciation in his eyes, Daniel glanced up at him. Jones, why are you doing this? You had the option to let them kill me. You wouldn't have been held accountable. Jones paused, looking away for a second. Because, Daniel, I know who you are. I am aware of your actions. You've saved lives. Hell, back in Kandahar, I was one of them. You didn't abandon anyone when things went wrong. You put your life in danger for your group. Daniel blinked for me, the memories coming back. A frantic fire, with smoke and sand all around. Jones was trapped down and yelling for assistance. Bullets flew past them as Daniel pulled him out, his back burning from the explosion's heat. You didn't abandon me, Jones stated firmly. I won't abandon you, then. Not right now. The weight of Jones' comments caused Daniel's normally composed demeanor to crack, tightening his throat. He felt something other than rage or terror for the first time in weeks. I hope. You have no idea how much that means to me, Daniel remarked softly. Jones stood up straight and gripped his baton more tightly. Don't thank me just yet. Just because I appeared once won't stop Kane and his team. They will exert more pressure, so you must be prepared. You must remain alert. Remain alive, Daniel nodded, his determination growing. I've experienced worse. I'll be there. Jones smiled slightly, but his eyes were still grave. Daniel, you're the toughest person here. Just keep that shiv near and don't let them break you. I'm not able to be everywhere. Daniel was able to laugh dryly. Jones, who was already in front of you, took a step back and looked at Daniel for a second before turning to go. When I can, I'll check in. Keep your head down. Daniel rested his hands on his thighs and leaned back against the wall as the sound of Jones' feet faded down the hallway. He didn't feel totally alone for the first time since he'd been cast into this hellhole. He exhaled softly and closed his eyes. He was startled and bruised, but not broken by the altercation in the shower room. He felt a ray of optimism now that Jones was at his side, even if it was only in silence. Daniel said to himself, I can do this, his voice barely audible but full of resolve. By no means was he not in danger yet. However, he had a shot as long as he had someone supporting him and believing in him. And that was plenty to sustain him. In the visitation room, Daniel sat in the same chilly chair, the scratched plexiglass separating him from Emily once more. His heart sank when he heard the door slam behind him. Something about the way she avoided looking at him told him right away that this was not going to be the wonderful news he much needed, though he was not sure why. Emily fidgeted with the edge of the notebook in her lap while adjusting her glasses. She appeared exhausted from the struggle she was waging for him beyond these boundaries. However, the doubt was more important than her fatigue. Emily, Daniel replied in a tight, low voice. What's happening? She exhaled slowly before finally looking him in the eyes. There has been a hold-up, Daniel. The remarks were like a kick to the stomach. His pulse sped and his chest tightened as he felt the air escape his lungs. A hold-up? A delay, what do you mean? Emily tried to reassure him by leaning in closer and speaking in a quiet but firm voice. The judge requests additional time to consider the evidence we provided. It's a good thing. It indicates that they are paying attention. However, it also indicates that your appeal hearing has been postponed by 1 more week. Daniel's knuckles turned white as his palms squeezed into fists on the table. He was unable to control his vocal tremble. 1 more week. I barely survived the previous one, Emily. You have no idea how things are in here. They're not holding out. Every day they come for me. She spoke immediately, I do understand, in a stern but sympathetic tone. Daniel, I am aware of the hazard. I'm doing my hardest to get you out, but it will take time. Daniel's voice rose as he snapped, I don't have time. The guard by the door moved a little, glancing at them, but Daniel had to speak more quietly. They're not going to stop, Emily. I've already been pursued by Kane and his team. Twice. The last time, I barely left, and that was only because someone stepped in. He trailed off, his jaw clenched, his head bobbing, if they come at me again. Emily's face flickered with shame as her eyes softened. Daniel, I understand. This is the only way to clear your name, even though I realize it's unfair and I'm sorry you're in this predicament. They'll shut it down if I exert too much pressure or take shortcuts. Everything will be lost. With a sharp exhale, Daniel leaned back in his chair and wiped his face with his palms. The room's walls seemed to press in on him as the panic tore at him. He said to himself, his voice hardly audible, 1 more week. Emily, I'm not sure whether I can pull it off. I'm not sure whether I'll make it through another week. Emily's palm was flat against the glass as she extended her hand toward it. It was a simple, pointless gesture, but it was reassuring nonetheless. Listen, Daniel. Things that most people would have died have survived you. You're stronger because you've been through hell before. I am aware of your fear. You can overcome this, but I would be too. You must. Fear and frustration swirled in Daniel's eyes as they met hers. It's not your responsibility to constantly look out for yourself. It's not you who needs to defend yourself against 6 men in a shower room. Emily, I'm doing everything I can. However, it is insufficient. I am insufficient. Her gaze remained intense, and her words grew softer. Daniel, you are sufficient. They are not as strong as you are. You're not alone either. You have Jones, and you have me. You are not alone in this battle. Daniel's head trembled a little as he laughed bitterly. Jones can't keep an eye on me. Just checking in on me is enough risk for him. You're out there, too. Not in this room. You have no idea how it feels to think that every shadow is someone who is out to get you. Emily's lips pressed into a narrow line as she paused. You're correct. I have no idea what it's like. However, I am aware of what it's like to struggle for an unattainable goal. I understand what it's like to think that everyone is against you. I have also experienced what it's like to emerge on the other side. Daniel gulped, his throat parched. With a tone laden with resignation, he repeated, another week. Emily gave a slow nod. Daniel, another week. All I'm asking is that. Give it another week. I'll also get you out of here. I swear. He gazed at the scratched plexiglass while leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. He muttered, I don't know if I believe in promises anymore. Emily's face remained unwavering. Then have faith in yourself. Have faith in the man who has endured everything this world has to offer. This is something you can accomplish. Their visit came to an end when the guard moved closer. As she stood, collecting her belongings, Emily's gaze remained fixed on Daniel's. I will return as soon as possible. Remain alert. Remain alive. With a slight nod, Daniel observed her leaving the room. He was left alone with his thoughts when the door clanged loudly shut. 1 more week. His legs grew heavier with each step as he made his way back to his cell, the words echoing in his thoughts. He would be confronted by the violence, the threats, and the terror. But he had to put up with it somehow. Because the truth about who set him up would die with him if he didn't. Daniel sat in his cell, staring at the crude shiv he had made a few days earlier, his thoughts racing. His ribs throbbed with each short breath, and his body still hurt from the beatings. However, the mental weight that was crushing him was far worse than the physical suffering. It was not survival to wait for another attack from the Steel Vipers. It was a suicide. He had to change his approach. Something audacious. He could no longer play defense if he wanted to survive another week. He needed to confront them. The following day, Daniel looked around the yard, his keen eyes searching for a chance. There were more powerful individuals in the prison besides the Steel Vipers. Like rival kingdoms, the gangs divided their territories and did not mix. However, he was aware that partnerships were occasionally formed for practical reasons. A group at the far fence caught Daniel's eye. The Strikers. Although they were fewer in number and primarily Latino and black guys, they were known to be strong when pressed. Ramon Ortiz, their commander, had a reputation for being pragmatic and was a wiry man with tattoos running up his arms. Daniel moved cautiously closer, making every move intentional to avoid attracting undue attention. Two strikers tensed as he approached, their hands fluttering for their homemade guns. Daniel stated calmly yet firmly, "I'm not here to start anything." From his seat on an improvised bench, Ramon looked up, his black eyes narrowing as he examined Daniel. "Why are you here, then?" Daniel maintained a neutral yet firm stance as he came to a stop a few feet distant. "I'm prepared to pay for assistance if I need it." Ramon leaned back and grinned. "Assistance? From us? Foster, you understand how this works. You're bringing your troubles to me if you're seeking for assistance." "Why would I desire that?" "Because," Daniel said in a steady but low voice, "I'm not seeking for a free handout. I am aware of your distaste for the Steel Vipers. They believe they are in charge of this area, as you and I both know. I can give you a chance to retaliate." The men surrounding Ramon looked at each other and whispered to each other. They were silenced when Ramon held out a hand. "Do you want Cain and his crew to fight us? Do you believe we are foolish?" Daniel gave a headshake. "Just a statement, not a conflict. They have been after me, and I am certain that they will not give up. They are not invincible, though. To take a couple of them out of play, I just need a small backup. Make a message." Ramon cocked his head in contemplation. "What do we get from this?" "Simply," Daniel said, "I'll owe you. I will make it worthwhile for you to defend me. Commissary trades, intelligence, or anything else you require." Ramon grinned again, but his eyes now had a tinge of respect. "You're brave. I'll grant you that. But in this field, courage isn't usually rewarded." Daniel retorted, "They do when they're supported by results. Even though I've been hit before, I've managed to stay upright. It will demonstrate to ever Yon in this yard that the Steel Vipers are not unbeatable if you assist me in taking down a couple of them. Compared to Commissary, that is worth more." Leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees, Ramon met Daniel's gaze. The world seemed to have shrunk to the two of them, even though the yard was bustling all around them. Finally, Ramon said, "Okay. You have a bargain, but you'll be on your own if things don't work out. You understand?" "You got it," Daniel stated in a firm tone. The strategy was put into action that evening. Ramon had informed him about Cole, a younger member of the Steel Vipers who frequently left the organization to smuggle illegal goods through the cell blocks after the lights went out. With his shiv concealed in his shirt sleeve, Daniel waited in the shadows next to the hallway. As he watched Cole's wiry figure approach, the only sound was the low hum of the overhead lights. His gait was easygoing. Daniel moved aside, obstructing his way. Cole widened his eyes and froze. "What on earth do you desire?" Daniel spoke icily, to convey a message. Daniel was quicker, but Cole's fingers flitted to his waistband. He swung forward, putting the shiv to Cole's neck and slammed him against the wall. Daniel said, "You tell Cain this stops now. I'll make sure he's the next one when he attacks me again. Have you got that?" Cole took a deep breath, catching it in short spurts. "Foster, you've passed away. We're not afraid of you." Daniel's voice fell to a lethal whisper as he pressed the shiv harder. "Are you certain of that? As I stand to gain nothing. And I'll bring as many of you along as I can, I swear. Proceed now." He took a step back, allowing Cole to stagger off, his confidence gone and his face white. Ramon stepped out of the shadows and gave a sign of approval. "Not very bad, Foster. Not awful at all." Daniel remained silent. He stared at the empty hallway in front of him. He would be attacked by the steel teeth once more. He was aware of that. He wasn't only waiting for them now, though. He was prepared to defend himself. With his back against the chilly concrete wall, Daniel stood in the dim, wet hallway close to the washing room. The tense atmosphere was not relieved by the distant whir of machinery. He wasn't by himself. He was surrounded by Ramon and 3 other strikers, all of whom had stern, determined faces. They anticipated it. "Everyone is coming," Ramon whispered, his voice almost audible above a whisper. "Are you certain that you wish to do this here? The guards will not intervene if things become unpleasant." Daniel's jaw tensed as he looked ahead into the deserted hallway. "I have no other option. They will continue to come if we don't stop them now. I will be dismantled piece by piece until nothing remains." Ramon's lips formed a narrow line as he nodded. "Okay, but we do this correctly if we're doing it. No pity." From the far end of the hall came the sound of heavy boots, which became louder with every step. Cain's piercing, derisive voice echoed through the atmosphere. "You're hiding back here like a rat, Foster. I assumed you were more resilient than that." To steady himself, Daniel inhaled deeply. He could feel the tension coiling in his muscles and the weight of the shiv tucked into his waistband. This was no longer merely a matter of survival. This was about permanently removing the threat. Cain was the first to emerge, his grin nasty and wide. 8 of his guys stood on either side, their hands gripping improvised weapons, their eyes glimmering with ill intent. Broken broom handles honed to points, pipes, and shivs. Well, Cain halted a few steps away and drawled. "Take a look at who choose to invite buddies. Adorable, but it won't help." Daniel took a step forward, his voice steady and icy. "Cain, this is where it ends. You attack me once more, and none of you are leaving." A sneer warped Cain's smirk. The altercation broke out without notice. Big talk for a dead man. With a pipe aiming at Daniel's head, one of Cain's men lunged. The metal whistled past Daniel's ear as he ducked and punched the man hard in the stomach. Daniel followed up with a knee to the attacker's face, causing him to fall to the ground as the attacker doubled over. As the 2 groups collided, the hallway descended into mayhem. The grunts, screams, and nauseating thuds of fists and weapons hitting flesh were accentuated by the cramped quarters. Ramon slammed him against the wall and rammed a shiv into his shoulder after tackling one of the steel vipers. Another striker struggled with 2 attackers simultaneously, launching his fists in swift, vicious succession. Cain took a furious swing, but Daniel turned barely in time to stop it. The turmoil around them seemed to subside for a second as their eyes locked. Cain had lost his smile and was filled with anger. "Foster, you're finished." Cain growled and lunged once again. Daniel ducked, grabbed Cain's arm, and gave it a violent twist. Despite his pained grimace, the gang leader punched Daniel in the ribs with his free hand. Daniel staggered back, gasping for air, but he got back up fast and slashed his shiv at Cain. Cain's forearm was slashed deep by the sword. Blood spilled into the floor as Cain yelled and staggered back. Around them, the battle continued. Daniel saw the strikers moving with accuracy and brutality as they held their own. The steel teeth, however, were not giving up. With their attacks driven by hatred and despair, one guy rushed forward for every one that fell. One of the bigger gang members tried to strike Daniel, but Daniel used his momentum to slam the man into the wall. The man collapsed to the ground as the impact sent a dull crack through the air. Foster. With a growl, Cain charged at him once more. As their bodies collided in a vicious struggle, Daniel braced himself. With a furious swing, Cain's fist struck Daniel's jaw and side. But Daniel retaliated just as fiercely. After driving his elbow into Cain's face, he kneed him in the stomach. Blood poured from Cain's nose as he swayed, but he remained upright. He picked up a pipe off the ground and swung it as hard as he could. Daniel sidestepped, the pipe brushing across his shoulder, and punched back, sending Cain tumbling. The hallway was a battleground all around them. The floor was covered in bloody, moaning bodies. The battle was far from done, though. As their numbers decreased, the Steel Viper's attacks became increasingly desperate. Daniel could feel the pain in his ribs and the strain in his muscles. He was unable to stop, though. He was unable to pay for it. He was aware that they would tear him to pieces if he slowed down, even for a moment. "Continue!" Ramon yelled. His voice broke through the confusion. Daniel tightened his jaw, concentrating on Cain. Cain's thigh was struck by the shiv as he rushed. The gang leader sank on one knee and shouted, dropping the pipe. "It's over," Daniel murmured in a low, lethal voice. Cain's chest heaved as he gazed up at him. "Do you believe this is the end of it? Do you believe you have won?" Daniel remained silent. Despite the anguish shooting through his body, he maintained a solid stance as he turned to face the other gang members. His voice reverberated along the corridor as he declared, "This is it." The steely teeth paused, their self-assurance finally giving out. As they saw at their commander on his knees, bleeding and battered, they exchanged unsure looks, the will to fight ebbing from them. The corridor resembled a battlefield, with the sounds of men moaning and the metallic tang of blood filling the air. Daniel stood in the center of the confusion, his limbs shaking from fatigue but his chest heaving in his hold on the shiv strong. Cain was kneeling, his fingers dripping blood as he gripped the wound in his thigh. The steel teeth were trembling. Fear and doubt had taken the place of the assurance that had led them into this ambush. Sharp and authoritative, Daniel's voice broke the tense silence. "This is your final opportunity. I'll make sure none of you leave this hallway standing if you don't move." A stocky man with a jagged scar over his cheek, one of Cain's lieutenants, stepped forward, his hands gripping a broken pipe. "Do you believe that we will simply roll over? Foster, you don't frighten us." Daniel's icy, unforgiving eyes were fixed on him. "Then take the initiative to find out." The lieutenant paused and looked back at his fellow soldiers. He lost because he hesitated. Daniel moved quickly to close the gap before he could respond, throwing his shoulder into the man's chest and pushing him back against the wall. Daniel punched him viciously in the stomach and then his jaw, bringing him crumpling to the ground as the pipe clattered to the floor. The rest of Cain's troops paused, their determination faltering. This was not what they had anticipated. Outnumbered, a lone man turned their ambush into a loss. But with a frenzied shout, one of them, younger and desperate, charged at Daniel. Evading the assault, Daniel grabbed the man's wrist and gave it a violent twist. Daniel thrust his knee into the younger man's gut and tossed him aside as the makeshift shiv he was clutching dropped to the ground. The remaining Steel Vipers were being held at bay by the strikers who were still engaged in combat. Ramon was a whirlwind of movement, his shiv flashing as he quickly elbowed another man in the temple and disarmed another. The strikes were savage and precise, and the other strikers moved with trained efficiency. Cain's face contorted in pain and rage as he attempted to stand up. Foster, you believe you've won? His voice was hoarse as he spat. With a grim grimace, Daniel turned to face him and said, "This doesn't end here. No, here is where it stops." He took Cain by the collar and pulled him to his feet as he moved forward at that moment. Cain delivered a ferocious blow, but Daniel grabbed his wrist and twisted it till Cain let out a cry. Cain was pinned against the wall when Daniel shoved him against it. "You caused this yourself," Daniel remarked in a low, menacing voice. "You had the option to leave me alone. You had the option to leave. However, you will now be held accountable for every threat, assault, and guy you sent after me." The tiniest trace of dread replaced Cain's defiance. His voice faltered, but he hissed, "You don't have the guts." Daniel's grip tightened as he leaned in. "Give me a try." Daniel doubled Cain over by twisting his knee sharply and driving it into his stomach. Coughing and panting for oxygen, he let Cain drop to the ground and then took a step back. Steel vipers moaned and bled as victims littered the hallway, their will to fight utterly destroyed. There was no need, but Ramon and the strikers were ready. The battle was over. Daniel looked around, his chest heaving and heaving. Even though his ribs were screaming in protest and every muscle in his body hurt, he managed to stand tall. He had fulfilled his obligation. He had communicated. With a stern but weary tone, Daniel replied, "Get them out of here." Scrambling to their feet, the remaining steel teeth pulled their wounded companions away. Cain was the last to stir, his body too damaged to accomplish anything but his hateful gaze. Cain snarled as he hobbled down the corridor, blood flowing with each step, "This isn't over, Foster." Daniel didn't answer, his attention was already changing. Though he was aware that Cain's warnings were unfounded, he had won for the time being. Hours later, Daniel sat in the infirmary with his body leaning against the rigid cot mattress and his side thickly bandaged. He hardly heard the nurse when she reprimanded him for exerting himself. With the fight's excitement still pumping through his veins, his thoughts was racing. In contrast to the mayhem he had just experienced, the infirmary was peaceful and a haven. Daniel was able to breathe for the first time in days. His mind was racing as he gazed at the ceiling. This was not the end, he knew. The steel teeth would return with more vigor, and the Cain would not end. But he had time for now. Recuperation time. It's time to reflect. It's time to get ready. There was a slight smile on his face. Even though he was in excruciating pain, he had made it through. That was enough for now. A few days later, Daniel sat in the visitation room's hard plastic chair, his bruised face marked with fatigue. He was bruised from the battle with Cain's gang, and the relief of having survived was beginning to wear off as the reality of what was coming set in. Emily Green entered quickly, her piercing, focused eyes focusing on him. When she noticed his wounds, she hesitated for a split second but immediately covered her worries. Leaning forward and speaking in a calm yet forceful tone, she took a seat across from him. "I have wonderful news, Daniel. The judge's ruling is in. The appeal was successful. You're leaving. Tomorrow." Her words lingered in the air as Daniel froze. The statement weighed heavily on him for a moment, and all he could do was blink. "Tomorrow?" His voice was low, almost incredulous as he questioned. Emily gave a nod. "It's official. You will be processed in the morning. You'll be out of this hellhole by this time tomorrow." Daniel felt a wave of relief, but it passed quickly. His thoughts instantly turned to the upcoming night. He whispered, more to himself than to her, "One more night." Emily's eyebrows knitted when she heard his tone. "You've already completed the difficult part, Daniel. You simply need to wait a bit longer." With his fists gripped tightly together and his voice low and stiff, Daniel leaned forward. "Emily, it's not that easy. I'm not the only one Cain and his group are pursuing for fun. Both of us are aware that someone set them up for this." Emily gave a slow nod. "We are aware that he was hired. Daniel, you don't need to prove that tonight. I can delve into the specifics once you're gone. All you have to do is live. Daniel grimaced as he shook his head. It won't cease if I go without answers. Kane's employer won't give up because I'm not there. They'll target me once more, but this time they'll be more astute. I'll be watching over my shoulder for the rest of my life if I don't figure out who it is and why they want me dead. Emily pressed her lips into a narrow line as she sat back in her chair. And you believe Kane will simply inform you? This isn't how it works, Daniel. Unless he has a good cause, he will never confess anything. I'll give him a reason, Daniel stated in a calm, icy tone. Kane lives on power and terror. He'll lose it if I take that away from him, even for a moment. If he believes he is already lost, he is too conceited to remain silent. Emily's face lit up with concern as she scowled. You've already taken a lot of chances, Daniel. You have come this far. Daniel's jaw tightened. Don't risk it now. Emily, it's not just about me anymore. The goal is to apprehend the person responsible. Before they destroy another person's life the way they destroyed mine. Tonight, I must do this. Emily's expression softened as she watched him for a long time. Do this wisely if you're going to do it. You're not unbeatable, Daniel, even if you've already shown that you can deal with Kane and his team. If something goes wrong, it won't, he interrupted her hastily. Failure is not something I can afford. Their visit came to an end when the guard moved forward. After a moment of hesitation, Emily flattened her palm against the glass and spoke steadily, even though her eyes were filled with emotion. Keep your wits about you, Daniel. Daniel nodded, his thumb grazing the glass. You're almost there. I appreciate everything, Emily. Daniel's thoughts were racing as he was led back to his cell. Kane was a key, not just a danger. Everything would be different if Daniel could corner him, break him, and force him to confess who had put out the hit. He wasn't going to waste the one night he had left in this hellhole waiting for another attack. He was going to be in charge tonight. The subtle hum of the overhead lights did little to break the stifling calm in the utility corridor, which had a heavy, stale air. At night, this section of the prison was rarely occupied, making it the ideal location for Daniel's task. His back was against the chilly concrete as he stood in the shadows close to the distant wall. His muscles were taut and prepared for what was going to happen, and every nerve in his body was stiff. As Daniel had intended, Kane was alone. Despite the obvious limp from the gash Daniel had inflicted in his thigh during their previous encounter, the gang leader walked confidently into the hallway. With his trademark sneer on his face, Kane looked over his shoulder, obviously oblivious to the fact that he was being watched. Daniel emerged from the darkness, his voice icy and piercing. Kane, are you looking for someone? Kane's body went rigid as he froze. His eyes narrowed as he slowly turned to face Daniel. His eyes flickered with something other than assurance for the first time. He forced a scowl and said, Foster. Daniel didn't answer right away. I didn't think you had the strength to come look for me. With deliberate and controlled motions, he moved closer, the tension between them igniting like static electricity. I need to talk to you, Daniel stated in a low, perilous voice. Kane snorted, but his bluster appeared to have diminished. Speak. Isn't that really your style? I assumed you preferred using punches to using words. A sardonic smile twisted Daniel's lips. We'll arrive. Daniel drew closer before Kane could respond, his fist making a vicious, accurate contact with Kane's jaw. A sneer from the gang leader's lips as he fell back, his hand shooting to his face. Do you believe you can scare me? Blood dripped from the corner of Kane's mouth as he spat. Foster, you're nothing compared to me. Daniel caught him by the collar and slammed him hard enough into the wall to cause the plaster to fracture. False. I have you covered in every way. Kane, I've faced men 100 times tougher than you, yet you're a thug. Tell me who employed you now. Kane's sneer wavered, giving way to a brief moment of terror, which he promptly covered up with rage. "You have delusions. I was not employed. It's a personal matter." Daniel slammed him harder into the wall this time. "Don't tell me lies. I've seen people like you before. You're not ignorant, but you're conceited and overconfident. Unless you were being paid to pursue me, you wouldn't take the chance." Cain laughed strangely, but it sounded more desperation than laughter. "What happens if I don't want to talk?" Cain was doubled over when Daniel's fist struck his gut. Cain fought to stay upright while coughing furiously and letting the air flow out of his lungs. He was forced to stand as Daniel grabbed him by the nape of his neck. "You will speak," Daniel said, his voice a menacing murmur. "Because I'll make sure you're completely different by the time I'm done with you if you don't." Cain wiped the blood from his mouth and gazed at him, his defiance faltering. His voice trembled a little, but he said, "You don't scare me." The horrific crack of Daniel's punch hitting Cain's ribs reverberated throughout the hallway. Cain screamed, clutching his side as his confidence crumbled. Leaning closer, Daniel spoke in a steady, icy tone. "Let's give it another go now. You were hired by whom?" Cain's gaze raced around the hallway as if seeking a way out, but there was none. He gasped for breath and, for the first time, his face showed true dread. With sorrow in his voice, he spat, all right. I'll speak." Cain was given just enough breathing room when Daniel gradually relaxed his hold. "I'm paying attention." Cain's tough man persona was gone, and his voice was tremulous. "It was a big-shot businessman named Foster. Wanted you to move aside. Said that you were an issue. That he was trying to seal a transaction, and you knew too much about it." Daniel squinted his eyes. "Foster? Can you tell me his entire name?" Cain said, "Elliot Foster," with a hint of desperation in his voice. "I swear, that's all I know. I and my team were hired by him to make your life miserable. Claimed we would receive a bonus if we killed you." Daniel tightened his hold on Cain's collar as his jaw clenched. "What about the proof? Was it planted by Foster to set me up?" Cain gave a desperate nod. "Yes. He claimed to have contacts and owed favors to those in the system. He got you thrown in here that way." For a considerable amount of time, Daniel gazed at him, his thoughts racing as the details started to come together. At last, he released his grip and pushed Cain to the ground. "Cain, you only have one chance to leave this situation. I'm going to complete what I started, so stay out of my way." With a pale and bloodied face, Cain clambered to his feet. Daniel was left alone in the silence as he staggered out of the hallway without saying another word. Daniel, his hands still clenched, inhaled deeply. At last he had a name, a place to start. He would be prepared to face those who attempted to ruin him when he left this prison tomorrow. He had to make it through the night first, though. With his back to the chilly concrete wall, Daniel sat on the edge of his cot in his poorly lit cell. Outside, the regular hum of nocturnal noise had been muffled to an eerie hush in the passageway. The slight pain in his ribs and knuckles brought back memories of his run-in with Cain. But he wasn't awake because of the discomfort. It was the burden of the following step. He looked at the little clock with the red numerals counting down the hours until sunrise that was fixed on the distant wall. He would be processed out in a few more hours. Freedom was very near. But it felt nearly inaccessible given how vulnerable his circumstances were. Cain was not going to take this lightly. The steel teeth weren't the kind to lose to someone without striking back. With his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, Daniel exhaled slowly. He kept thinking about Elliot Foster, a somber reminder of the greater battle that lay outside these gates. He had to survive the night first, though. Outside his cell, the quiet was broken by heavy, methodical, and approaching footsteps. As Daniel listened, his muscles stiffened and coiling. A guard wasn't taking a leisurely walk. Something other, something intentional. He stood up, staring at the shadow moving across the floor just outside the bars. The figure halted in front of Daniel's cage, and Daniel felt his chest constrict as Cain emerged, his face still wounded and battered from their previous run-in. 3 more steel vipers, with stern, merciless faces, stood behind him. 3 were seen carrying what appeared to be a pipe, a shiv, and a jagged piece of metal. This time they didn't waste their time on pretense. Cain's smirk vanished, to be replaced by a darker, colder one. "Foster, you believe that you can simply leave after humiliating me?" It was a low, poisonous voice. "I am ensuring that you do not see them in the last hours of your life." Calm and poised, Daniel took a step toward the bars. "Cain, do you really want to repeat this? It didn't go so well for you the last time." Cain laughed harshly and bitterly. "Last time, you were fortunate. I'm not going to hold back this time." Daniel's mind was calculating as his gaze shifted to the weapons they were holding. Underneath his mattress, if they could open the door, they could easily reach his shiv. There were no guards in sight, and he knew better than to hope for assistance. He had to fight this battle, and it was not going to be pleasant. One of his men produced a crude key made from a stolen tool after Cain nodded to him. The door of the cell creaked open as the latch clicked. Daniel stepped back, his body stiffening as the men moved in, their motions predatory and calculated. With his arms folded, Cain remained at the doorway while his soldiers moved forward. "Take your time," he said, in a tone full of hate. "Ensure that he experiences every moment of it." With a broad arc of his pipe swing, the first man lunged. Sidestepping, Daniel grabbed the man's wrist and gave it a quick twist. The man sprawled into the cot when Daniel rammed his elbow into his face, causing the pipe to clatter to the floor. The second guy didn't hold out. He lunged toward Daniel's side, shiv in hand. In order to create a temporary shield, Daniel grasped the side of the cot and flipped it up. As the blade went into the mattress, Daniel took advantage of the diversion to drive his fist first into the man's jaw and then into his gut. Breathing heavily, the assailant collapsed. Evidently spooked by how swiftly Daniel had dispatched the others, the third man paused for a moment. But he was pulled forward by Cain's look. He flung the sharp metal object toward Daniel's head. Daniel dodged, the weapon brushing his shoulder, and delivered a vicious punch in return. Daniel didn't let up when the man faltered, kicking him hard in the knee to send him tumbling to the ground. Cain took a stride forward now, his anger blazing brightly but his confidence ebbing. "Do you think anything will change as a result?" he snarled. "You're still dead, Foster, whether it's tonight or tomorrow. You're not walking out of here alive." Daniel's chest heaved as he turned to face Cain, his fists bloody but steady. "You've already lost, Cain. I'm still standing. Your men are down, and tomorrow, I'm walking out of here, and you'll still be rotting in this hellhole." Cain roared, lunging at Daniel with reckless abandon. The two collided in a chaotic grapple, fists flying and bodies slamming into the walls. Daniel's ribs screamed in protest, but he fought through the pain, every movement driven by sheer willpower. With a final surge of strength, Daniel drove Cain into the corner, pinning him against the wall, his forearm pressed against Cain's throat, cutting off his air. "This is over," Daniel growled, his voice cold and unrelenting. "You've got nothing left," Cain struggled weakly. His face red and contorted with rage, but he couldn't break free. Finally, Daniel let him go, stepping back as Cain slid to the floor, gasping for breath. Daniel stood tall, his chest heaving as he surveyed the wreckage. The steel vipers were beaten, their leader broken, their will shattered. He staggered back to his cot, his body screaming in protest, but he allowed himself a faint, grim smile. He had survived the night. The morning came slowly, the faint rays of sunlight filtering through the narrow, grimy window of Daniel's cell. His body ached from head to toe, his ribs wrapped tightly with bandages, courtesy of a nurse who had barely glanced at him during the late-night checkup after the fight. But none of that mattered now. Today, he was walking out of this hell, the clang of keys snapping him out of his thoughts. A guard appeared at the bars, clipboard in hand, and an expression of mild disinterest. "Foster, time to go." Daniel exhaled deeply, rising from the cot with deliberate slowness. Every movement reminded him of the brutal battles he'd survived, but the pain didn't bother him. It was a reminder of what he had endured to make it to this moment. As he stepped out of the cell, he glanced down the hallway. Cain was slumped against the bars of his own cell, his face swollen and his lips split from the beating Daniel had given him. Their eyes met briefly, and Cain's expression twisted into a hateful glare. "This ain't over, Foster." Cain rasped, his voice hoarse. "You hear me? You're not safe out there." Daniel's lips curled into a faint smirk, his tone steady and cold. "You keep saying that, Cain, but here I am, walking out while you're stuck in this cage. Looks like I'm the one who won." Cain slammed his hand against the bars, but Daniel didn't look back. The sound faded behind him as he followed the guard down the corridor, each step bringing him closer to freedom. The processing room was stark and clinical. Its walls painted a lifeless gray. Daniel stood silently as the clerk went through the usual motions, handing over his personal belongings, a watch, a wallet, and the dog tags he hadn't seen since the day he'd been incarcerated. He held the tags in his hand for a moment, the cool metal pressing against his skin like a lifeline. They were a reminder of who he was, who he still had to be. The clerk droned on, explaining the release process, but Daniel barely listened. His mind was already on what came next. He had a name now, Elliot Foster, and a purpose. He wouldn't rest until the man who had put him through hell faced justice. As the final papers were signed, Emily walked into the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Her sharp eyes immediately landed on Daniel, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Daniel." He turned, his face softening ever so slightly. "Emily." She approached, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "I thought I'd meet you here, make sure everything went smoothly." Daniel nodded, slipping his dog tags over his head. "Thanks. For everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Emily's smile grew, but there was a seriousness in her eyes. "You're out now, Daniel. But this fight isn't over. Foster's still out there." Daniel's jaw tightened at the name. "I know. He's the reason I'm in this mess, and he's the reason I can't just walk away. But now I have a chance to do something about it." Emily hesitated, her voice dropping slightly. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. I've already started digging into Foster's background. He's careful, but no one's untouchable." Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Good. Because I'm not stopping until I bring him down." The guard signaled that it was time to leave, and Emily stepped aside, letting Daniel walk toward the door. As he crossed the threshold, the bright sunlight hit him like a wave, warm and blinding after weeks of fluorescent glare and shadowy corridors. He paused for a moment, letting the warmth wash over him before stepping fully into the outside world. The car ride was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as Emily drove them away from the prison. Daniel stared out the window, watching the landscape pass by in a blur of green and gray. His body was still sore, but his mind was sharp, focused on what came next. "You've got somewhere to stay?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Daniel nodded. "I'll figure it out. First, I need to regroup. Get my head on straight." "And Foster?" She pressed gently. Daniel's gaze hardened, his voice low. "He's next," Emily nodded, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Whoever Foster is, he has resources. He managed to frame you, hire a gang to kill you in prison, and keep his hands clean. He's not someone to underestimate." Daniel's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I don't underestimate anyone. But Foster made one mistake. he didn't finish the job. Now, it's my turn. Emily didn't respond, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. As they pulled up to the small apartment Emily had arranged for him, Daniel stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. The scars of his time in prison were fresh, but his resolve was unshakable. He turned to Emily, offering her a nod of thanks before heading inside. Once alone, Daniel sat at the small bare table, pulling out a notepad and pen. He wrote one word at the top of the page. Foster. Beneath it, he began listing everything Kane had told him, every connection he could think of. The next phase of his fight had begun. He wasn't just free, he was armed with the truth. And that made him more dangerous than ever. Daniel sat at the table in the dimly lit apartment, his fingers tracing the edge of the notepad in front of him. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of traffic outside. On the page, the name Elliot Foster stared back at him, circled twice in heavy pen strokes. Beneath it, a scattered web of notes, fragments of information Kane had spilled under duress. Each word was a piece of a puzzle that Daniel knew he had to solve. He leaned back in his chair, the faint ache in his ribs reminding him of just how close he'd come to losing everything. But pain didn't matter now. He was free, and the man who had taken everything from him was within reach. Foster had framed him, orchestrated the attacks in prison, and tried to bury him. That kind of arrogance left trails, no matter how careful someone thought they were. Emily had left him with a burner phone, urging him to call if he needed anything. She'd promised to continue digging, but Daniel wasn't one to wait around for answers. He had learned long ago that action was the best defense. Daniel's first stop was a public library, its sterile interior a far cry from the chaos of prison. He found a quiet corner and booted up one of the computers, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he searched for everything he could about Elliot Foster. It didn't take long to uncover the basics. Foster was a high-level real estate developer, his name attached to several lucrative projects across the city. On the surface, he looked clean, a philanthropist, a family man. But Daniel knew better. Digging deeper, he found whispers of controversy buried in obscure articles and blogs, land disputes, shady deals, allegations of intimidation tactics, all things that had never made it to the mainstream media. Foster had a way of keeping his hands clean, using others to do his dirty work, while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he jotted down addresses and names tied to Foster's projects. One name stood out, Haven Enterprises, a shell company listed on several contracts. It was vague enough to avoid attention, but Daniel recognized it for what it was, a front. He printed out what he needed, tucking the papers into his jacket before leaving. As he stepped outside, the cool air hit him like a wake-up call. He pulled the burner phone from his pocket and dialed Emily's number. "Daniel?" She answered quickly, her voice sharp and alert. "Everything okay?" "I found a lead," he said, keeping his tone low as he scanned the street. "Foster's tied to a company called Haven Enterprises. I need you to look into it, find out who's running it, who they've been paying." Emily paused for a moment before responding. "I'll dig into it, but Daniel, be careful. Foster's powerful. If you start poking around, he's going to know." Daniel smirked faintly. "Let him. He's been coming for me this whole time. It's about time I returned the favor." Emily sighed. "Just don't do anything reckless. I'll call you as soon as I have something." Daniel hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He had no intention of waiting for answers. If Haven Enterprises was Foster's operation, there would be people who knew the truth. People who could be persuaded to talk. By nightfall, Daniel found himself in front of a small, unassuming office building in an industrial part of town. The sign on the door read, Haven Enterprises, the letters peeling slightly at the edges. It didn't look like much, but that only confirmed what Daniel already suspected. This wasn't a real business. It was a hub for whatever Foster was hiding. He slipped inside, the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee filling the air. The front desk was empty, and the building was eerily quiet. Daniel moved cautiously, his eyes scanning every corner as he made his way down the hall. Most of the doors were locked, but one near the end of the corridor was slightly ajar. Inside, he found a small office cluttered with paperwork and a single computer. Daniel scanned the room quickly, his gaze landing on a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled it open, rifling through the folders until he found what he was looking for. Contracts, payment records, and a list of names. Foster's web was bigger than he'd imagined, spanning multiple cities and involving more than just the prison hit. There were bribes, kickbacks, and connections to local officials. Daniel's stomach tightened as he read the names. This wasn't just about him. Foster was running a full-scale operation, using intimidation and force to silence anyone who stood in his way, and Daniel had been one of those people. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, pulling Daniel from his thoughts. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the shiv he'd kept hidden since prison. The sound grew louder, closer. He slipped behind the desk, crouching low as the door creaked open. A man entered, his movements cautious. A phone pressed to his ear. "Yeah, I'm at the office now," he said. "No, everything's quiet. Foster's just being paranoid." Daniel stepped out of the shadows, his voice cold and sharp. "Is he?" The man froze, his eyes widening as he turned to face Daniel. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm the guy Foster tried to bury. Now, you're going to tell me everything you know, or we're going to have a problem." The tension in the small office was palpable as Daniel stepped closer to the man, his imposing presence filling the room. The man looked younger than Daniel had expected, his nervous energy radiating through every tense muscle in his body. His phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the desk, and his wide eyes darted to the door as if considering an escape. "Don't even think about it," Daniel said, his voice low and sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. He stood just feet away, his posture relaxed but ready, the aura of someone who had survived worse than whatever came next. "You're not getting past me." The man swallowed hard, his hands raising slightly in a gesture of surrender. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I'm just an assistant. I don't know anything." Daniel's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. "An assistant who's here at night, talking to Foster about how paranoid he's getting. Don't insult my intelligence." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, forcing the man to meet his gaze. "Here's how this works. You tell me what I want to know, and you get to walk out of here in one piece. You lie to me, and things get messy. Understand?" The man nodded quickly, sweat beading on his forehead. Okay. What do you want to know?" "Start with your name," Daniel said, his tone calm but laced with authority. "Eric," the man stammered. "Eric Foster." Daniel's eyebrow arched. "Foster? Any relation to Elliot?" Eric hesitated, then nodded. "He's my uncle. I do some work for him. Nothing illegal, I swear. Just paperwork. Errands." "Save it." Daniel interrupted. "Your uncle framed me, put me in prison, and hired people to kill me. I don't care what your job description is. What I care about is what you know." Eric's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, panic flashing across his face. "I don't know much. He doesn't tell me everything." Daniel's fist slammed onto the desk, rattling the papers and making Eric jump. "Then tell me what you do know." Eric recoiled, his hands trembling. Okay. He's been using Haven Enterprises to launder money and funnel bribes. He's got people in the city council, law enforcement, even the courts. Anyone who gets in his way either gets bought off or disappears. Daniel's jaw tightened. "And what about me? Why did he target me?" Eric hesitated, his eyes darting to the door again. Daniel straightened, stepping closer, his presence looming. "Don't make me ask twice, Eric." Eric let out a shaky breath. You were part of a deal that went bad. Foster wanted to acquire some land for one of his developments, but the owners wouldn't sell. You said them, didn't you? Told them how to protect their rights? Daniel's chest tightened. He remembered the case. A small community that Foster had tried to muscle out of their homes under the guise of urban development. Daniel had worked with them, pro bono, to block the deal. It hadn't been easy. But they'd won, or so he'd thought. "That's why he came after me," Daniel muttered, the pieces clicking into place. "I cost him millions." Eric nodded quickly. "He couldn't risk you coming after him again. Said you were too good at digging up dirt, making waves. So he found a way to take you out of the picture. And the evidence he used to frame me?" Daniel pressed. Eric swallowed hard. "He's got connections. Dirty cops, shady lawyers. They planted the drugs in your car, set you up for distribution. It was airtight." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, his fury barely contained. "And the steel vipers? Was that part of his plan too?" Eric nodded, his voice trembling. "Yeah, after you got locked up, he figured you'd find a way to survive. Said you were too stubborn to die on your own. So he paid Kane and his crew to finish the job. Said it had to look like prison violence, nothing that could be traced back to him." Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Foster had orchestrated everything, pulling strings from the shadows to destroy his life. But now, Daniel had the name, the motive, and the method. Foster's carefully constructed web was starting to unravel. Eric's voice broke through his thoughts. "Please, man, I told you everything I know. Just let me go." Daniel stared at him for a long moment, weighing his options. Eric was a pawn, but pawns could still be dangerous. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, but if you warn Foster, if you try to run, I'll find you. And next time, we won't be talking." Eric nodded frantically, stumbling toward the door. "You won't hear from me, I swear." As the door slammed shut behind him, Daniel sat back in the chair, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. Foster had built his empire on lies, intimidation, and corruption. But now, Daniel had what he needed to tear it all down. Tomorrow, the hunt would begin in earnest. Foster wouldn't see it coming. Daniel sat in the quiet apartment, his mind racing as he laid out the papers he had taken from Haven Enterprises alongside the notes he had written. Each name, each connection, and every whisper painted a vivid picture of the corruption Elliot Foster had built his empire on. The anger simmering inside Daniel was tempered only by his laser-sharp focus. He wasn't just going after Foster. He was going to dismantle everything the man had built. The burner phone buzzed on the table, snapping Daniel out of his thoughts. He grabbed it quickly, seeing Emily's name flash on the screen. "Emily," he said, answering immediately. "Daniel, I found more on Haven Enterprises," Emily said, her voice tense but steady. "It's worse than we thought. Foster's been using it to hide everything. Bribes to city officials, kickbacks to contractors, even payouts to gangs like the Steel Vipers. He's got layers of people protecting him." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I figured as much. He's been operating like this for years, hasn't he?" "Years," Emily confirmed. "But here's the thing. He's gotten sloppy. Some of the payments haven't been fully laundered, and I found a few that trace back to his personal accounts. If we can connect those payments to the people he's hired, we can start building a case." Daniel nodded, his mind already forming a plan. "We'll need more than just payment trails. Foster's got people in law enforcement, maybe even the courts. If we take this to the wrong person, it'll disappear before it ever sees the light of day." "I know," Emily said. "That's why I've been reaching out to a few trusted people I've worked with before. If we can get enough hard evidence, we can bypass Foster's network entirely. But it's going to take time. Time isn't something we have, Daniel replied. Foster knows I'm out, and he's going to come after me. If we wait too long, he'll bury everything before we can touch him. Emily hesitated, then sighed. You're right. But we have to be smart about this. If you go charging in without a solid plan, he'll find a way to spin it. You need something undeniable. Daniel's eyes fell on the pile of papers in front of him, his gaze narrowing. I'll get it. Foster's dirty money isn't just sitting in accounts. It's tied to people. Places. If I can find one of those people and make them talk, we'll have what we need. Emily's voice dropped to a serious tone. You're talking about direct confrontation, Daniel. That's dangerous. Foster's not just going to let someone close to him spill his secrets. I'm not waiting for permission, Daniel said firmly. Foster sent people to kill me. I'm not giving him the chance to do it again, Emily exhaled slowly. Just promise me you'll be careful. I've already started compiling everything I've found so far. I'll send it to you once it's ready. But Daniel, you're walking into a hornet's nest. You need to be sure you're ready. I've never been more ready, Daniel said, his voice cold and certain. This isn't just about me, Emily. Foster's hurt a lot of people, and it's time he paid for it. Daniel spent the rest of the night mapping out his plan. The records he'd taken from Haven Enterprises included several names, contractors, middlemen, and low-level enforcers who had been on Foster's payroll. One name stood out, Garrett Lang, a contractor who had been paid significant sums for security services. It didn't take much to guess what that really meant. Garrett's address was listed on the paperwork, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city that doubled as his base of operations. Daniel recognized the type, a place where deals were made in the shadows, far from prying eyes. He packed a small bag, ensuring he had everything he needed. The shiv from prison was still tucked into his jacket, a grim reminder of how far he was willing to go. As he zipped up the bag, his mind drifted to the fight ahead. Garrett wasn't likely to talk willingly, but Daniel had faced worse odds before. The warehouse was a hulking, shadowed structure surrounded by empty lots and chain-link fences. Daniel parked his car a block away, moving quietly through the darkness as he approached. The faint sound of voices and the glow of a single light spilling out from the warehouse door told him he was in the right place. He slipped through a side entrance, his movements silent and calculated. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and stale cigarettes. Garrett was easy to spot, a broad, rough-looking man standing near a table piled with cash and ledgers. Two other men flanked him, both armed, their laughter echoing through the cavernous space. Daniel moved closer, staying in the shadows, his pulse steady. This wasn't a brawl in prison or a desperate fight for survival. This was something else, a calculated strike. He stepped into the light, his voice sharp and commanding. Garrett Lang. The room went silent as the three men turned toward him. Garrett's eyes narrowed, his hand drifting toward the gun on his hip. Who the hell are you? The man who's about to make your life very difficult, Daniel said, his voice cold as steel. Sit down, Garrett. We need to talk. The room was heavy with tension as Daniel stepped closer, his imposing figure framed by the dim, flickering overhead light. Garrett Lang stiffened, his hand hovering near the gun on his hip. The two men flanking him shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Daniel and their boss. I don't know who you think you are, Garrett said, his voice gruff, but the slight tremor in his hand betrayed his confidence. But you've got about 10 seconds to turn around and walk out of here before this gets messy. Daniel didn't flinch, his gaze locked on Garrett. Messy is exactly what I'm looking for if you don't sit down and start talking. One of the armed men stepped forward, his hand gripping the butt of his pistol. You got a death wish, pal. In a blur of movement, Daniel grabbed the nearest wrench from the workbench beside him and hurled it with precision. The heavy metal struck the man's hand, knocking the gun to the floor. Daniel followed up with a swift kick to the man's stomach, sending him sprawling into the corner. The second man hesitated, his grip tightening on his weapon. But Daniel was already on him. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply until the gun clattered to the ground. A sharp elbow to the temple left him crumpled on the floor next to his companion. Garrett didn't move, his eyes wide as Daniel turned his full attention to him. "Your guys are down. You're next if you don't sit your ass in that chair." For a moment, Garrett looked like he might resist. But the look in Daniel's eyes, cold, unrelenting, made him think twice. He slowly lowered himself into the chair by the table, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," Garrett said, trying to mask his fear with a smirk. "But you're playing a dangerous game." Daniel pulled one of the fallen guns from the floor, ejecting the clip and tossing it aside. He leaned against the table, towering over Garrett. "The only game I'm playing is the one where I get answers. You're on Foster's payroll. You've been running security for his operations, cleaning up his messes." "Start talking," Garrett snorted, crossing his arms. "You think I'm going to rat on Foster? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? He'll bury you." Daniel grabbed the back of Garrett's chair, dragging it forward with a screech that echoed through the warehouse. He leaned in, his face inches from Garrett's. "You're worried about Foster. You should be worried about me. I've got nothing to lose, Garrett. And I don't have time for games." Garrett's bravado faltered, his smirk slipping. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the space. "Don't lie to me. I know you've been handling his dirty work. You've got two choices. Talk now, or I'll make sure Foster knows you've been spilling his secrets. How long do you think you'll last when he thinks you've flipped?" The color drained from Garrett's face, his resolve crumbling under Daniel's relentless glare. "All right. All right. Fine. What do you want to know?" Daniel straightened, his expression hard. "Start with why Foster wanted me out of the picture. Why go through the trouble of framing me and hiring a gang to finish the job?" Garrett hesitated, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "You cost him a fortune, man. That community you helped block his development. That was just the beginning. He was planning to expand, turn that whole area into some billion-dollar project. But you derailed it, and the investors backed out. You embarrassed him. And the frame job?" Daniel pressed. Garrett nodded. "He needed you out of the way. Couldn't risk you doing it again. He had the connections. Cops, lawyers, judges. It was easy for him to set you up. And once you were inside, he figured you'd be easy to handle. That's where I came in." Daniel's jaw tightened, the steel vipers. "You coordinated that?" Garrett swallowed hard. "I handled the payments. Foster told me to keep it clean, make it look like typical prison violence. Kane and his crew were eager to take the money. They didn't ask questions." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "And now? What's Foster planning next?" Garrett hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in. "He's paranoid now that you're out. He's been shifting money, erasing records, covering his tracks. He's got some big meeting coming up, something about a new deal to secure his position. I don't know the details, but if you want to catch him, that's where you'll find him." Daniel leaned back, his mind racing. "Where's the meeting?" Garrett's voice dropped to a whisper. "An office building downtown, top floor. It's one of his properties. But you didn't hear that from me." Daniel stepped back, his expression cold. "You're right, I didn't." Garrett sagged in the chair, relief washing over him as Daniel turned toward the door. But Daniel stopped, glancing over his shoulder. "If I hear you've warned Foster, I'll be back." And next time, we won't be talking. Garrett nodded quickly, his face pale. You won't hear a word from me. Daniel walked out of the warehouse, his step steady and his purpose clear. He had the location, the details, and the momentum. Elliot Foster's carefully constructed empire was about to crumble. The city's skyline glimmered in the night, its towering buildings casting long shadows over the streets below. Daniel sat in the darkened apartment, the faint glow of the burner phone screen illuminating his face as he reviewed the intel Emily had sent him. The details from Garrett matched what she'd uncovered. Elliot Foster was hosting a high-stakes meeting in one of his office buildings downtown. It was a final move to secure his position, to lock down his network of bribes and deals before Daniel could bring it all crashing down. Daniel set the phone down, his mind racing. This wasn't just another step. It was the moment. If he played this right, Foster wouldn't just be exposed. He'd be ruined. But Foster wasn't an idiot. The man would have protection, layers of it. Daniel would have to be ready for anything. Emily arrived just before midnight, her expression as grim and focused as his. She placed a laptop on the table and sat across from him, her tone brisk. I've got everything we need. Foster's been using that building as a hub for his operations for years. The top floor is essentially his private domain. Guards, secure servers, the works. Daniel nodded, scanning the schematics she'd pulled up on the screen. What's the security like? Standard corporate during the day. But at night, it ramps up, she explained. Private security firm. Ex-military types. Foster doesn't trust just anyone. There's no walking in the front door unnoticed. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. Then I'll have to find another way in. Emily frowned, her concern evident. Daniel, this isn't like dealing with Kane or his gang. These people are professionals. If they catch you, it won't end well. Daniel leaned back, his gaze steady. I don't have a choice, Emily. If I don't get to Foster tonight, he'll bury everything. The money, the connections, it'll all disappear and I'll be back to square one. Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. All right, if you're going to do this, let's at least make sure you have the advantage. She pointed to the schematics. The building has a service entrance on the east side, usually used for late-night deliveries. It's lightly guarded, but it'll still get you inside. Daniel studied the map, his mind piecing together the plan. Once I'm in, the elevator to the top floor requires a keycard. Emily continued. Garrett said Foster will be in his private conference room. That means you'll need to either take out one of his guards or find another way up. The stairwell's an option, but it's monitored by cameras. Daniel smirked faintly. Cameras can't stop me. Emily shot him a look, half amused, half exasperated. They can alert the guards, so be careful. Over the next hour, they finalized the plan. Emily provided him with everything she could. Details on guard rotations, camera placements, and even a list of Foster's known associates who might be present. As they worked, Daniel's determination only grew. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about justice. For himself and everyone Foster had trampled in his pursuit of power. Finally, Emily leaned back, her expression softening. Daniel, you don't have to do this alone. I can call in some favors, get more people involved. Daniel shook his head. The more people know, the more chances Foster has to find out. This needs to be clean, quiet. Emily hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Just promise me you'll be careful. Foster's not going to go down without a fight. Daniel's smirk returned, this time with a hint of dark humor. Good. Neither am I. Before he left, Daniel took a moment to prepare. He packed lightly a black duffel bag with a few essentials. Gloves, a small flashlight, and the shiv he'd carried since prison. It wasn't much, but Daniel knew how to make the most of limited resources. He slipped into dark, nondescript clothing and checked his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked older, harder, but there was no mistaking the fire in his eyes. This was the man Foster had tried to break, the man who refused to stay down. Emily walked him to the door, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "I'll be monitoring everything I can from here. If something goes wrong, call me." "I mean it, Daniel." He nodded, his expression softening for just a moment. "Thanks, Emily, for everything." She gave him a faint smile, but worry lingered in her eyes as he stepped into the night. Trace. The streets were quiet as Daniel approached the building, sticking to the shadows. The office tower loomed above him, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the city lights. To anyone else, it was just another corporate hub, but Daniel knew better. This was the heart of Foster's empire, a symbol of the man's power and corruption. Daniel circled to the east side, his steps silent, as he approached the service entrance. As Emily had predicted, there was only one guard stationed outside. His posture relaxed. Daniel moved swiftly, his training taking over. Before the man could react, Daniel had him in a chokehold, easing him to the ground without a sound. He grabbed the man's keycard and slipped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the hum of the building's systems filling the silence. Daniel's movements were precise, his focus unwavering as he made his way toward the elevator. The real challenge was just beginning. The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, revealing the opulent design of the top floor. The space exuded wealth and power, polished marble floors, modern art on the walls, and a panoramic view of the city glowing in the night beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. But to Daniel, it was all a facade, masking the rot beneath. This was the heart of Elliot Foster's empire, and tonight, it would begin to crumble. Daniel stepped out cautiously, the keycard he'd swiped from the guard still in his hand. He slipped it into his pocket, his sharp eyes scanning the hallway ahead. The silence was unnerving, but he knew better than to trust it. Foster wouldn't leave this space unprotected, especially not tonight. As Daniel crept down the hall, he counted the doors, matching them to the floor plan Emily had shown him. The conference room was at the far end, behind a pair of heavy double doors. Between him and his target, however, were two guards, both standing near the entrance to the room. They were tall, broad-shouldered men, their stances alert, and their weapons visible beneath their jackets. Daniel crouched behind a decorative planter, taking a moment to observe their movements. They weren't casual. They were scanning the area, occasionally speaking into their earpieces. Foster wasn't taking any chances tonight. Daniel's fingers brushed the handle of the tucked into his jacket, but he hesitated. A direct confrontation would be messy, loud, and would risk alerting Foster. He needed to be smarter than that. His eyes flicked to a nearby emergency panel on the wall, an idea forming. He moved silently, sticking to the shadows, until he reached the panel. With careful precision, he pried it open and found what he was looking for. A fire alarm control. It wasn't the kind that would trigger a full evacuation, but it would create enough of a distraction to pull the guards away from their post. Daniel pressed a button, and a sharp beeping noise filled the air. The guards immediately tensed, their hands moving to their weapons as they exchanged glances. "Go check it out," one of them barked, nodding to his partner. The second guard moved toward the source of the sound, leaving his companion alone at the doors. Daniel seized the moment. Daniel moved swiftly, closing the distance to the remaining guard in seconds. He struck with precision, a sharp jab to the man's neck followed by a quick sweep of his legs. The guard crumpled to the floor, stunned but still conscious. Before he could recover, Daniel clamped a hand over his mouth and pressed the shiv to his throat. "Don't make a sound." Daniel hissed, his voice cold and steady. "I'm not here for you. Where's Foster?" The guard's eyes darted nervously to the double doors. "In there." Daniel pressed, applying just enough pressure to make his point. The guard nodded frantically, Daniel leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How many are inside?" "3, the guard muttered. "Foster and 2 more guards." "That's it, I swear." Daniel's gaze hardened as he studied the man's face, searching for any sign of deceit. Satisfied, he pulled the guard's radio from his belt and smashed it against the floor before shoving him against the wall. "Stay here. Move, and you'll regret it." The guard nodded quickly, his fear keeping him frozen in place. Daniel turned his attention to the doors, his hand tightening around the shiv. The adrenaline coursing through his veins sharpened his focus. Every sense heightened. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to catch the muffled voices on the other side. Foster was speaking, his tone clipped and authoritative, but Daniel couldn't make out the words. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was it, the moment he had been working toward since the day he was framed. Everything hinged on what happened next. Daniel pushed the doors open just enough to slip inside, the conference room coming into view. It was as opulent as the rest of the floor, with a long mahogany table dominating the space and sleek monitors lining the walls. Foster sat at the head of the table, his suit impeccable and his expression calm. He didn't even look up as Daniel entered, as if he were completely unaware of the intrusion. The 2 guards flanking him, however, reacted immediately, their hands flying to their weapons. "Don't," Daniel said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. He held the shiv in one hand and the guard's pistol, which he had taken earlier, in the other. The barrel was pointed directly at Foster. "Unless you want your boss to take the first hit." Foster's head lifted slowly, his gaze meeting Daniel's with a calm, almost amused expression. "Mr. Foster," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Daniel stepped further into the room, his every movement calculated. "I've had enough of your games, Foster. This ends tonight." Foster leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Does it? Because, from where I'm sitting, you look like a desperate man with nothing to lose." Daniel's grip tightened on the pistol. "You're right about one thing. I've got nothing to lose. But you've got everything. And I'm about to take it all away." The guards hesitated, their hands hovering near their weapons as they glanced at Foster for direction. "Stand down," Foster said coolly, waving a hand. "Let's hear what Mr. Foster has to say. After all, he's gone through so much trouble to get here." Daniel's eyes burned with determination as he stepped closer, his focus unwavering. "Start talking, Foster. Tell me everything, or I'll tear this whole operation apart piece by piece." Daniel's hand tightened on the pistol, the weight of the moment pressing down on him as he stared at Elliot Foster. The man leaned back in his chair, his face an unreadable mask of cold confidence, but his eyes flickered with unease. "You've made a mistake, Foster," Foster said, his voice laced with derision. "You think barging in here changes anything? I've built this empire to withstand people like you." Daniel took a slow step closer, the recording device in his pocket already running. "You didn't build anything, Foster. You stole it. You framed me, hired gangs to kill me, and bribed your way out of every crime you've committed. The only thing you've built is a house of cards, and it's about to fall." Foster smirked, but there was a slight twitch in his jaw. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it? Even if what you're saying were true, who's going to believe you? You're an ex-con. No one cares what you think." Daniel leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're going to care when this is all over, but I'm not leaving here without hearing it from you." Foster scoffed, crossing his arms. "Hear what exactly? Your conspiracy theories? Save it, Foster. This little act of yours is pathetic." Daniel grabbed the chair Foster was seated in and yanked it forward, the sudden motion making Foster flinch. "No more games," Daniel barked. "You framed me, Foster. You planted evidence, paid off judges, and hired gangs to kill me in prison. Admit it. For a moment, Foster's mask of confidence cracked, but he quickly replaced it with a sneer. I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel slammed his hand down on the table, the sharp crack reverberating through the room. Don't lie to me. I've got Garrett Lang's testimony. He told me about the payments to the Steel Vipers, about the bribes, about everything. You think you can keep this buried? Think again. Foster's lips pressed into a thin line, but his silence spoke volumes. Daniel took a deep breath, reining in his rage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the recording device, placing it on the table. The red light blinked steadily, its presence a silent witness to everything that had been said. What's that supposed to prove? Foster asked, his voice wavering slightly. Daniel's smirk was humorless. It's proof that you're done. Every word you've said since I walked in is on record, and once you admit the truth, there won't be a single doubt about what you've done. Foster's gaze darted to the guards, his calm facade slipping further. You're bluffing. You don't have anything. Daniel leaned closer, his voice sharp and cutting. You really want to test me? Fine. Let's talk about Haven Enterprises. About the bribes tied directly to your accounts. About the evidence Garrett handed over. Emails, payment logs, even photos of you meeting with gang leaders. You think you're untouchable, but I've got enough to put you away, and if you don't admit it now, I'll make sure every one of your associates knows you turned on them first. Foster's face paled, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. His hands curled into fists, his breathing uneven. You don't understand. He said finally, his voice a low growl. I did what I had to do. You were a threat to everything I've built. Daniel's eyes narrowed. So you admit it. You framed me. You planted the drugs and paid off everyone to make sure I went down for it. Foster hesitated, but the pressure was too much. Yes, he snapped, his voice rising. I did it, all right. You cost me millions with your damn advice to those people, and I couldn't afford for you to get in my way again. So I made sure you were out of the picture. The room fell silent. The weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. Daniel's expression didn't change, but inside, he felt the first stirrings of vindication. And the Steel Vipers? You paid them to kill me in prison. Foster glared at him, his defiance flickering. You don't get it, do you? This isn't personal. It's business. You were a loose end, and I tied it up. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand steady as he gestured to the recording device. Thank you for confirming that. Foster's eyes widened as the realization hit him. The double doors burst open, and Emily entered, flanked by Detective Harris and a team of officers. Elliot Foster, Harris announced, his voice firm as he held up a warrant. You're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, attempted murder, and other charges. Everything you just said is on record, and we've got enough evidence to take down your entire operation. Foster shot to his feet, but the guards were already stepping back, raising their hands in surrender. You can't do this, he shouted. His voice panicked. I built this city. You don't know what you're doing. Daniel stepped aside as Harris approached, his expression calm. No, Foster, you don't know what you've done, but you're about to find out. As Foster was cuffed and led away, he continued to yell, his threats falling on deaf ears. Daniel turned to Emily, the faintest hint of relief softening his features. It's over, he said quietly. Emily nodded, her voice steady. For now, but you've done it, Daniel. You've cleared your name. Daniel exhaled deeply, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. Now it's time to make sure this never happens again. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as Elliot Foster sat at the defense table, his once impeccable suit slightly rumpled. The weight of his trial etched into every line of his face. The media had descended on the case, reporters crowding the gallery, their cameras banned but their pens flying furiously across notepads. Foster's empire, once a symbol of unshakable power, had become a spectacle of public disgrace. Daniel sat a few rows back, his expression calm but watchful. He had no reason to be here. His testimony had been given weeks ago and Emily had assured him that the evidence they'd provided was damning enough to secure a conviction. Still, he couldn't stay away. He needed to see it through, to hear the words that would officially close this chapter of his life. At the front of the courtroom, the prosecutor stood, her voice confident and sharp as she delivered her final argument. Elliot Foster believed he was untouchable. He used his wealth, his influence, and his connections to manipulate the system, to ruin lives, and to silence anyone who got in his way. But today, we've proven that no one is above the law. The evidence is clear, the testimonies are undeniable, and justice demands a verdict of guilty. The defense attorney rose, his face pale but composed as he began his rebuttal. Foster's team had fought hard, throwing every technicality and loophole they could find at the prosecution. But even the most skilled legal maneuvering couldn't erase the mountain of evidence stacked against them. The recordings, the payment logs, the testimony from Foster's own associates, it was all there, laid bare for the jury to see. Daniel's gaze drifted to Foster, who sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly together. The man's defiance had waned over the weeks of the trial, replaced by a quiet, simmering rage. Daniel could almost feel it from where he sat, but he didn't care. Foster had underestimated him, and now he was paying the price. The jury returned after only 2 hours of deliberation, their verdict swift and unanimous. As the foreperson stood, the tension in the room was palpable. On the charges of conspiracy, bribery, and attempted murder, the foreperson announced, her voice clear and steady, "We find the defendant, Elliot Foster, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by the hushed murmurs of spectators and reporters. Foster's shoulders slumped, the reality of his downfall crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His attorney leaned over, whispering furiously, but Foster didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, his expression a mask of shock and defeat. The judge's gavel struck the bench, silencing the room. "Sentencing will be determined at a later date," she said firmly. "For now, the defendant will remain in custody. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom began to empty, Daniel remained seated, his eyes fixed on Foster as the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs. Their gazes met briefly, and for a moment, Daniel saw the hatred burning in Foster's eyes. But it didn't matter. The man was finished, his empire in ruins, his power stripped away. Emily appeared at Daniel's side, her expression a mix of relief and satisfaction. "It's done," she said quietly. "He's going away for a long time." Daniel nodded, his voice calm. "It's not just about him. It's about everyone he hurt. The people who lost their homes, who were threatened or silenced. They deserve justice, too." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm, and they got it. "Because of you," Daniel turned to her, his gaze steady. "Because of us, I couldn't have done this alone." She smiled faintly, but there was a seriousness in her tone. "So what now? You've cleared your name. Foster's out of the picture. What's next?" Daniel hesitated, his mind drifting to the scars left by the ordeal. The fight had consumed him for so long. But now, for the first time in years, he felt free. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to figure it out." Emily nodded. "Whatever you decide, you know where to find me." Daniel smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he'd felt in a long time. "Thanks, Emily, for everything." As he stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight hit him like a wave, warm and bright. The city stretched out before him, bustling with life, oblivious to the battle that had just been fought within its walls. Daniel took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in months. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was a new beginning. The scars of what he'd endured would never fully fade, but they would serve as a reminder of what he'd fought for, of what he'd won. Elliot Foster's empire was gone, and with it, the shadow that had loomed over Daniel's life. Justice had been served, and now it was time to rebuild. Daniel sat on the worn bench at the edge of the park, the sounds of the city buzzing faintly in the distance. The cool evening breeze brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass. He hadn't been here in years, not since before his life had been torn apart. It felt surreal to sit in the open air, without bars or walls closing in around him, free to breathe and think without fear. He let out a long, steady breath, leaning back against the bench as his gaze drifted to the horizon. The trial was over. Foster was behind bars, and the weight that had pressed down on him for so long had finally lifted. For the first time in years, the fight was over. But the scars of the battle lingered. Daniel's mind often wandered back to the prison, to the dark, suffocating halls, and the constant tension that came with knowing he was a marked man. The steel vipers, Cain, the night spent wondering if he'd survive to see the morning, it all played in his mind like a reel he couldn't turn off. He clenched his fists unconsciously, the phantom sensation of the shiv still lingering in his grip. There had been moments in that place when he thought he might lose himself, when the fear and the anger threatened to overwhelm him. But somehow, he'd held on. Somehow, he'd found the strength to keep fighting, to survive. Survive, he muttered to himself, the word hanging in the air. It wasn't enough just to survive. He'd learned that the hard way. Survival without purpose, without hope, wasn't living. It was just existing. And for a long time, that's all he'd been doing. Existing, waiting for a chance to clear his name, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. Now, that chance had come. Foster's empire was gone, his network of corruption dismantled, the guards who turned a blind eye, the lawyers who twisted the truth, the judges who sold their verdicts. All of them were being investigated. Their connections to Foster laid bare. And the Steel Vipers? The gang had been broken. Their leadership scattered in the aftermath of Cain's downfall. Justice had been served. Not just for Daniel, but for every person Foster had hurt, every life he tried to destroy in the name of greed. Daniel's thoughts turned to the prison again, to the faces of the men he'd fought and the few he'd reluctantly trusted. He thought of Jones, the guard who had given him hope when he thought he had none. He wondered if Jones had heard about what had happened, if he'd ever know the role he'd played in helping Daniel survive. He thought of the nights spent lying awake, listening to the taunts and threats echoing from the cells around him. He'd been terrified, but he hadn't let it break him. He'd fought back, not just against the men who came for him, but against the fear itself. And in doing so, he'd found a part of himself he thought he'd lost, the part that refused to give up, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. A soft voice broke his reverie. Daniel, he turned to see Emily standing a few feet away. Her expression soft, but serious. She held 2 coffee cups, one of which she extended toward him. Thought you might need this. Daniel accepted the cup with a faint smile. Thanks. She sat down beside him, her gaze following his toward the horizon. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything they'd been through hanging between them. It's strange, Daniel said finally, his voice quiet. I spent so long fighting to get here. To prove the truth. To clear my name. And now that it's over, I don't know what to do next. Emily took a sip of her coffee before replying. That's normal. You've been in survival mode for years, Daniel. It's going to take time to adjust, to figure out what comes next. But you've earned that time. You've earned the chance to live. Daniel nodded slowly, her words sinking in. I want to help, he said after a moment. The men in prison. Some of them deserve to be there. But a lot of them, they were just like me, caught in a system that's designed to chew them up and spit them out. Maybe I can do something about that, Emily smiled faintly. You'd be good at that. You've seen the system from the inside. You know how broken it is, Daniel exhaled. The beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. Yeah, and maybe, for the first time, I can stop surviving and start building something. For myself and for others. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. You've got a long road ahead, but if anyone can do it, it's you. Daniel met her gaze, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Emily. Thank you. She shook her head. You didn't need me, Daniel. You just needed someone to remind you of who you are. Daniel turned back to the horizon, his chest rising and falling with a deep, steady breath. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The scars of his ordeal would never fade completely, but they were no longer a burden. They were a reminder of what he'd overcome, of the strength he'd found in himself. He wasn't just free, he was alive. And for the first time, he was ready to live. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.